All right, everybody, welcome here to show 171 on Crypto Voices. Matthew Majinskis, your host here from the Baltics, as always. Very happy to be joined here today with my special guest, Tim Starr. Tim actually came across my radar recently. We were having a discussion on Twitter over the Ukraine war, of course, as all of you know, is very important to us over here in Eastern Europe. And he directed me to some of the articles that he has written over the years about libertarianism, about national defense, about non-interventionism, which I think would be very apropos and interesting to talk about today. Very happy to have him on. Tim, good morning. Thanks for joining me early. Your time central. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks. Glad to be here. How are you?
Yeah, very good. Very good. I want to get right into it. As I mentioned pre-show, I think I have actually come across your articles before, but it's a long time ago. I had a good refresher recently reading many of your articles. And yeah, I guess just before we get into that, could you tell our listeners and viewers a little bit about what your interests are and why you write about what you write about?
I used to work for an organization that is now known as Liberty International back in the 90s. And one of the things that they do is organize world conferences once a year in a different part of the world. So I attended a number of those, and they were in places like Athens, Berlin, Vilnius, Rome. So I've been to a lot of these countries. I've met a lot of people from all over the world who are, pretty high up in libertarian activism in one way or another. Including the present mayor of Vilnius, Remigius Samazius. I remember him as that kid that picked us up from the airport in Vilnius back when he just worked at a free market think tank there. And now he's gone on to, bigger and greater things.
He will come into our story later.
Yeah,
well, yes.
Right, exactly. Then I've always been an avid reader. Liberty International used to own a bookstore, libertarian bookstore in San Francisco, where I lived at the time. San Francisco was lucky enough to have not just one, but two libertarian bookstores in town because Laissez-Faire Books was also there. So I basically got to read whatever I wanted from the bookstore while I worked there. And I ended up getting very interested in the topic of free market military defense and what it would take to militarily defend a free society. That led me into reading up on military history, which has become a pretty consistent interest of mine ever since. And I'm still at it, still reading, still studying, probably more about World War II and the Cold War than anything else. And I've found that not a whole lot of other libertarians know that much about these things, especially these days. A lot of the people I used to know in the movement, back then, seemed to know a lot more. Like I knew John Hospers, who was the first Libertarian Party presidential candidate. I knew Yuri Maltsev before he died. He died recently, unfortunately.
Yes.
So I'm very sad that we've lost people like that. And, I even knew people on the other side of the fence. I knew Justin Raimondo, who was the founder of antiwar.com, even though we disagreed quite sharply about a lot of things. I knew George Smith, author of Atheism, The Case Against God. I never met Rothbard himself, even though we're going to be talking about him. I also know Walter Block, who was quite close to Rothbard for a long time.
Yeah, very interesting. And I think, we can set the table with some of what I want to do is get into sort of, let's get into the arena of how libertarians look at national defense, and let's compare that with, the reality of wars that perhaps the United States has been in or not been in, and how that has affected certain nations. But, you talk about national defense in a free market. One of the quotes that I often think about is David Friedman's quote, just calling it the hard problem. National defense is the hard problem, which I certainly agree with. I don't think there's an easy answer there. But, brass tacks, as you look at the state versus the market, or you look at authoritarian states versus democratic states, which is the reality that we're in right now, what is your position on sort of a just and true way to go about national defense for a society, and also a society that might need to protect its neighbors? Not to lead you anywhere there, but
Sure, no problem. Well, there's a lot to be said about that. I think you hit on one of the major points, though, which is that I think a lot of libertarians think that the alternative that we face is either the state, meaning whatever state you happen to live under, does it, or the free market does it. And I think the real alternative that we face most of the time is either our state does it or some other state does it. And frequently, the other state is worse. In fact, almost always, at least in recent history, as far as I know. I don't think there's been a lot of instances of, let's say, states highly approximating libertarianism, conquering other territory and liberating it. Certainly not much in the past century that I can think of.
Well, just one, maybe the elephant in the room for some listeners as well. Usually the whataboutism with this war with Putin is immediately the Bush war in Iraq, second Bush. I've always just said, look, you could very much be against the invasion of Iraq, and you can be against the invasion of Ukraine. It's just how I look at it. But I know the Iraq war is still controversial for some people, but I don't know your opinion there. Maybe that's something to just address as well, is the United States certainly has engaged in interventionist wars, such as Iraq, which seem like kind of quagmires. What would you say about that?
Well, I guess the briefest overall statement I can make about that is that not all wars are the same. I think we had a much harder time in Iraq than we needed to, because the U.S. military establishment was engaged in a whole lot of wishful thinking about what kinds of wars it really did and did not want to be able to fight. I don't think there's anyone that I've met that thinks that Iraq was better off under Saddam Hussein. I read a book on the history of fascism by Stanley Payne, and he basically said at the time Saddam hadn't been overthrown, he said that Iraq was the most fascist state that had ever existed since World War II. And I think that's pretty accurate. He was a genocidal dictator. He committed genocide against the Shiites. He committed genocide against the marsh Arabs, the Arabs that lived in the marshes of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. I think I feel sometimes like one of the last diehard defenders of the Iraq War, and that may get me a lot of people that disagree with me about that. But I also would say that there's a huge difference between the war in Ukraine now and the Iraq War. Ukraine was, I'd say still is, a functioning democracy. There is, a lot of domestic support for defending the country against its invader, against Russia. Russia clearly is ruled by a fascist dictatorship now. It's openly engaging in genocide. It's, using vastly indiscriminate attacks where it targets hospitals, it targets civilians directly, it destroys cities. We didn't do anything like that in Iraq. We didn't target hospitals. We didn't destroy whole cities. until, well, with Fallujah, we had completely evacuated the civilian population first. And, certainly the death toll has been bandied about for Iraq, but I would argue that the really high estimates for how many people we supposedly killed in the Iraq War are completely bogus, and that's been well established by now. One of my favorite factoids about the Iraq War is back when we only had Iraq under sanctions, we hadn't invaded yet. It was very common for people to claim that 500,000 babies had died in Iraq due to the sanctions. And that claim has now been completely debunked because we've been able to, do research there. And it turns out that Saddam just cooked the books. He faked the numbers. He actually had orders that every baby that died in the country had to be given to the regime, and they would put it in a morgue, and then they'd have these dead baby parades where they get them all out of the morgue and they'd, parade them to make the sanctions look bad. And, I'm not the world's biggest fan of sanctions. I think that they are justified sometimes, but, it pretty clearly is the case that there was absolutely no change in infant mortality in Iraq during the period when there were sanctions in Iraq. So I think there's been a whole lot of lying going on. And I think one of the big problems that libertarians have is they believe that the enemy of their enemy is their friend. They think their enemy and their only enemy is the state that they happen to live under. And anything that anyone says that's bad about their state must be true, even when the people saying those things are, some of the worst people in the world who are infamous for lying about everything.
Yeah, I actually agree with all of those points, and this isn't even the topic I wanted to talk about today, as I know you know. But and maybe we can bracket this. But I let me ask one more about Iraq, because the pretense of the invasion. I listened to an interview with Tim Snyder and Bill Kristol. Bill Kristol was obviously a leading neocon luminary at the time, and it was not an interview long ago. But Tim Snyder, he's more on the left, as most people know, and he's said something to the effect of, with Iraq, we went in under false pretenses. I was just watching a interview with someone from the British MI5 or MI6, I can't remember which one, but it was who said that the connection between what happened in 9/11 and then with everything that was going on in Iraq was shameful. She was some, high-ranking MI5 official. I don't have her name on the now, but the point is, I think it's, with what Colin Powell said or what Bush said in front of the United Nations, all of these things, obviously, they compound. Not everybody had complete information at the time. But if we're talking about, it's my last question here, just to push back a little bit. If we're talking about the rules-based order, if we're talking about sovereignty and these things, and I agree with everything you said about how, the enemy of my enemy is definitely not my friend. Libertarians are way wrong to think about these things. But to push back on the one, on that narrative of the pretenses that we went in, do you think that, there was some injustice there on the side of America, or on the whole, you still see it? You still see it as, with the information that we had at the time?
I would distinguish between the justification for overthrowing Saddam and the effectiveness of how we did it. So I think so basically Saddam was a Russian puppet. And this is an aspect that is not well recognized these days. Saddam's KGB handler was Primakov. And Primakov was one of the heads of the Russian government before Putin in the late 90s under Yeltsin. Primakov would go to Baghdad to meet with Saddam every time, we wanted Saddam to, give up so that, among other things, so that we could lift sanctions on Iraq. And Saddam always refused. Primakov talked him out of it. I actually think that one of the reasons why Putin hates Ukraine is that the Ukrainians helped us figure out what happened to Saddam's weapons of mass destruction. They identified the Russian special forces units that helped smuggle them out of the country into Syria and Lebanon. They sent in specialists in chemical weapons to help us deal with the stuff that we did still find in the country. And I don't know why this seems to have been memory hold by everyone, but the New York Times even ran an article a few years back about how the U.S. Veterans Administration is treating Iraq war vets for WMD exposure. I even knew a guy who worked over there as a military contractor, and he was exposed to chemical weapons over there. We didn't publicize it at the time because we didn't want the insurgents finding them and using them against us in IEDs. But basically, we had a bunch of old chemical weapons that they hadn't gotten around to getting rid of yet. And when we found them, they were ordered to dig a big pit and dump them in the pit and burn them all to destroy them. And a bunch of the soldiers that did that got exposed to the fumes from that. And they're injured for life in one way or another. So, I don't go along with the notion that the whole thing was done under completely false pretenses. I think that they thought it would be a lot easier than it was. They didn't adequately prepare. They didn't adequately allocate the right forces for it. They thought it would be a purely conventional operation. They thought there wouldn't be any counterinsurgency phase. I always thought that was a mistake. I think they didn't prepare the public for the length of the war that would have to happen there. One of the ways I got into studying military history is I read everything I could find about guerrilla warfare, and that's what we ended up doing there. And every successful guerrilla campaign, counterinsurgency, that I know of in the past 100 years or so, has taken at least 10 years. So I think there's a big problem with telling people, oh, it can be quick, it'll just take a year or so, and we can all say, it's over a year in, and it just wasn't. And I think a lot of people, their expectations were not met by a long shot by that. And then, there were a lot of things that they didn't talk about publicly because either they didn't think it would be politically damaging, but it really was, or they had actual security concerns for the people involved in the operation.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, I think, like I said, I think we could bracket it. It's also interesting. You talk about guerrilla warfare. I know for sure, just from what I know about the Baltic history, of how there were people during the Soviet times that were fighting in the forest. They actually had a name. They called them the Forest Brothers. They were fighting until the 60s.
Yes, so I've read about them.
And that's going to happen in Ukraine one way or another, 100%. That's going to happen. They're never going to stop fighting for their land. But I think it's a good segue into what's happening because, whether you talk about Iraq, whether you talk about Vietnam, even, it gets back to this fundamental question, in my view, of where libertarians almost like to remove themselves from the argument. The argument of the day, the political argument of the day, whatever it might be, and sort of put themselves on a high horse. And I speak as a libertarian. I imagine you do as well, in many ways, in many economic fundamental ways. Mm-hmm. Actually, I'm not sure about your opinions, but you write a lot about libertarians.
It's a little complicated, but I sometimes jokingly refer to myself as an anarcho-warmonger.
I very much would like to flesh that out as well, this show. So yeah, the basis of my question was that libertarians like to sort of remove themselves from the morass of the debate and say that they're sort of above it. They're non-interventionists. They use this very word that is supposedly very pure and pristine. when in reality the world is a very, very messy place, and there are things that have nothing to do with United States foreign policy at all. For example, what happened with the Baltics being taken over, or Finland being invaded, or Poland being invaded during World War II. And I think World War II is obviously very analogous to what's happening today in Ukraine, whether people want to admit it or not, like it or not. And that's what I think we should really spend the bulk of our time talking about. So
Yep.
with that in mind, having said that, our friend Murray Rothbard has written a lot here, and you have critiqued a lot of his writings. I almost don't know where to begin. Your articles, by the way, are on Liberpedia. Very good articles. We'll link to all of them in the show notes here.
Thank you.
His main contention basically is that the Soviets. Let's even go back to World War I. His main contention is that the Soviets were these sort of peaceful, from an international perspective, non-interventionist regime or group of people that were trying to get something better for themselves, and were not bloodthirsty, deranged peasants, which is what they were in reality. And so he tries to paint this picture that they weren't. And you take that on full speed. You go from World War I to World War II. Where do we begin here, Tim, with this?
Well, I think the Bolshevik Revolution is probably the best place. So in the aftermath of World War I, essentially, and I think World War I is where a lot of this really starts. Rothbard ends up going back further than that, but I think if it weren't for his commitments to World War I revisionism, a lot of the other things that he says wouldn't follow. But the other thing here is that I remember when a lot of the early people in the libertarian movement were very diehard anti-communist, and in fact, at one time in the 50s, Rothbard was as well. You can find speeches from way back then when he was still allied with George Reisman, where they're making speeches and in defense of Senator Joseph McCarthy. So it's bizarre to me that he ended up taking this completely opposite line on the Soviets. And I think in some ways he was influenced by them, theoretically. For instance, initially the Soviets were very big on guerrilla warfare as the primary way to operate, and having a citizen militia only. And Rothbard essentially adopted that as his, ideal defense policy. The idea being that it would be, beholden to the people and not likely to engage in warfare outside the borders. Now, the Soviets quickly learned in the Russian Civil War that this didn't work. It just wasn't adequate. So they had to re-professionalize their military in order to resist the opposing forces in the Russian Civil War. But also, as part of that, the Soviets also tried to expand in every direction that they possibly could, and they just failed, fortunately, for a while. For instance, in 1920, they tried to invade Poland. They did invade Poland. Their plan was that, they were going to move through Poland on their way to Germany. And, according to Orthodox Marxism, Germany was really supposed to be the first country to go communist in the world, because Marx's theory was that ideally the most capitalist countries in the world would go first. It didn't work out that way. Marx actually did think it was possible for Russia to go communist, thanks to essentially foreign importation of industrial technology. That did end up happening, but they thought that they had the Spartacist uprising in Germany. The Russian embassy was supporting the insurgents there at the time, with weapons and funds and propaganda. And fortunately, the invasion of Poland failed completely. But, to me, that quite clearly proves that the intention goes all the way back to at least 1920 to, spread communism by force. from its base in Russia. There were also attempts to reclaim other territory that the Russian Empire had lost, and they consolidated a lot of it. They got a lot of it back, not all of it. They didn't get Finland, they didn't get the Baltics, they didn't get Poland, but they tried.
And they did get Belarus and Ukraine after a 4-year civil war, and
yes,
and that is something that honestly has gone on to this day. And it wasn't a foregone conclusion that Ukraine would come. There were socialist anarcho movements in Ukraine at the time. Most people think in the West World War I ended in 1918. It actually ended in 1922 for Russia.
Yeah, so I think Rothbard just either denied or justified all of this. I mean, they play this game of changing their position and moving the goalposts all the time. At first it didn't happen, and then second, okay, it did happen, but they were justified in doing so. So, for instance, in World War I, there was a peace treaty between the brand new Bolsheviks, as they were known at the time, and Germany. It was called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and it basically said that Germany could keep all of the territory that it had captured up to that point in the war, and Germany was winning the war on the Eastern Front in World War I, and the Bolsheviks would give up that territory. This was a very controversial decision by Lenin at the time amongst his own party, but he basically said, we have to, we have no choice, we can't beat the Germans. And so Russia had given up its claims on all that territory. Well, Rothbard makes a comment in one of his articles about how, Russia just wanted their territory back, and that's the only reason why they did any of this, stuff to try and invade any of these countries, that just happened to be in between Moscow and Berlin. This is territory they'd renounced. They'd given it up. Plus, it wasn't even formally part of Russia itself. It had been part of the Russian Empire, but it wasn't actually Russia. It was all of those other countries that we've been talking about. And those countries had never been ruled by the Bolsheviks. So, why would the Bolsheviks have any just claim to them? It doesn't make any sense at all.
It's a quagmire for libertarian theorists like Rothbard to try to shoehorn this into, the Baltics in particular. People forget, even if you move it past, if you go into World War II and the Baltics were reinvaded again and occupied, the United States never recognized the Baltic occupation, the Soviet occupation of the Baltic states for 50 years, which a lot of people are even surprised at. Since 1918, Finland, the Baltics have had uninterrupted diplomatic relations with the United States. That surprises a lot of people. And that's a great thing. That's something that should be defended without a doubt, 100%. I mean, you can read, the Baltics are really one of the, there's a few others you could talk about, examples like this in the world, but it's pretty difficult to talk about. If states, this is what I mentioned to you this before we, when we were chatting about doing a show here, if it's an important thing for libertarians to say that, you once had statehood, you had to have a meaningful state to be talking about if your land is really sovereign. Well, the Baltics had that, actually, and if you needed to have a big state, you could go all the way back to the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which in fact encompassed most of Ukraine and Belarus. Came after the Mongol invasions in the 1200s and 1300s, and the Lithuanians kind of picked up the pieces there. They were known as the Land Vikings. And look, I mean, none of this is libertarian in practice. I mean, we're talking about spoils of war and things like that, but somehow there's a line drawn in the sand where, Ukraine, I'm jumping around a little bit, but just to bring it back to what Putin is saying about Ukraine still to this day, which libertarians eat up hook, line, and sinker, is that, well, actually, Ukraine never did really have a state, did they? And this was all a Bolshevik creation, and they don't deserve the sovereignty that they had. Forget that the fact that they've been multiple agreements signed in the 1990s post-Soviet Union, biggest disaster created in human history besides Maoist China, but these basic facts that they seem to just overlook and take it anywhere you want there. But I always have a hard time with with the libertarians who say, you know what, let's just Ukraine can't fight them. They can't put them, they can't stop this Russian invasion. Just let them take what they need to take. They got nuclear weapons. It is what it is. Basically saying that unless you're a large state or unless you're a state with some massive, 1,000-year history, which, by the way, the Baltics have had, you did let us fall in the past. It was a problem. We got free again. We're going to continue to be free one way or another. And this is the same thing that's going to happen with Ukraine. So you might as well face it now. This is what those of us in Eastern Europe who have dealt with this, 50-year, 100-year occupation, depending on who you're talking to, we've dealt with this. So again, I'm jumping around a lot there, but these are the points that libertarians sort of just refuse to take head on, and they sort of just defer to the aggressor. And they say, you know what? It's okay. It's okay. You can take this land. You have nukes.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with everything you're saying there. I think that, to me, the root of the problem is that, as you rightly quoted David Friedman saying, national defense is the hard problem. And I'm a big fan of David. I've met him several times. I like his methodology. I think he's very honest. He knows a lot of history. He's a medievalist, among other things, which means you have to know a lot of history. I think the Rothbardians these days, the Hoppians, if you can call them that. I've met Hoppy as well. I've heard him speak several times. They try to sort of hand wave and wish away the problem. They try and pretend that it isn't really a problem, or, if there ever are any national defense problems, mostly they talk about this in the U.S. context. They basically blame America for causing them. And I would certainly agree that America makes mistakes, but I think for the big national defense problems that we've had in the past century or so, we certainly weren't the only ones involved in causing them, and I don't think we were primarily to blame for them. But they basically think that, if only America does nothing, we won't have any national defense problems. And I think that's just historically naive, and it's certainly not true for a lot of other countries in the world. The smaller ones. And, one of the reasons I care so much about this is I know that some of the freest economies in the world today are in the Baltics. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. I've been to Lithuania. I have friends in Latvia. And if we allow freedom to fall in those countries, then that's going to discredit the idea of freedom for a long time in a lot of ways. People are basically going to say, oh, well, it's nice to have free markets and all this prosperity, but you can't defend it. So, why bother? Let's do something else.
Completely agree. I want to quote from your article here. I think this gets to the crux of the point of what we're talking about. So you're quoting Rothbard here. The announced intentions of all the Marxist-Leninist theoreticians, from Lenin down to the present, are notably different. They call repeatedly and consistently for a policy of peaceful coexistence by communist countries with the, quote, capitalist powers. And then you are responding to this, which I think really gets to it. You wrote, and of course, tyrants who hold millions of their subjects in terror, having mass murdered a good deal of them, would never lie to the rest of the world about their intentions. When such rulers say belligerent things, appeaseniks like Rothbard tell us they don't really mean them and are just engaging in rhetorical speeches for the benefit of their domestic audiences. When these rulers say pacifistic things, these same people tell us that's what the rulers really mean. In fact, judging by Soviet practice, the opposite rule of interpretation applies. When such tyrants talk peace, they're lying. I thought that was great.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's quite accurate, and pretty undeniable. If you read a lot of Soviet history and Soviet rhetoric, you find them using these sort of euphemisms all the time, when what they really mean is something completely different. Stalin was famous for using the phrase, as is well known, when he was going to just spout something that no one had ever heard before and was completely false.
Sounds very Putin-esque.
Yeah, exactly. I look at Putin these days and I see him as picking from the buffet of Russian foreign policy options from all of Russian history and sort of mixing and matching and essentially picking up all of the worst ones and combining them. He's sort of a mix of czarist imperial restoration plus, whatever he thinks he needs from the Soviet period, whether it be Stalin or somebody else. Basically does whatever he wants. I just recently, I had the copy of this book by Richard Pipes about Tsarist Russia called, Russia Under the Old Regime. It was published, in the early 70s when I was born. And I've owned it for decades. I just finally recently read it. And he says basically this, that in the Tsarist period, ideology was always optional. It didn't really matter what ideology they had or they pushed or they based their decisions upon. Power was all that really mattered there. The Tsars basically said, all we care about is our power, and we'll say whatever is convenient to us in the service of our power, and we'll do whatever we want, like Cartman from South Park. And there's a lot of this history of Russian imperialism that has been completely forgotten today. For instance, as recently as the 19th century, Russia exterminated almost all of the Circassians in one of their bouts of imperial expansion. The only Circassians left in the world today are the ones that fled to the Ottoman Empire. And in fact, it's ironic that we talk today about things like cultural appropriation. So the official dress sword of the Russian military is the shashka, which is a saber. And the Russians will do this saber dance where you twirl one or two of these sabers around your body. They adopted that from the Circassians. The Circassians were the ones that did the saber dancing as an indigenous art form, and it got picked up by the Cossacks. Ukrainians do it too, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. But we hear all this stuff today about how cultural appropriation is a bad thing. The Russians do it all the time. They've always done it. They've done it for centuries. I mean, the very notion of Moscow renaming itself Russia was an act of cultural appropriation from the Kievan Rus. They had the name first, and Russia came along and said, "Oh, actually, we're Russians." There was some common ancestry way back when, but Kiev is much older than Moscow.
As are with the Poles, as are with the Czechs, as are with Slovaks, and they're not claiming, that they're, the lineage of some great Russian dynasty. It's completely made up from Putin's side. I mean, the Tucker interview was an abomination, and he goes to, he could not be more Kafkaesque, go into the subway to do, to take video footage after his interview, to go to the grocery store, like Russia, which is it was a French grocery store, by the way.
Right. And I've been to that subway station. I've been to Moscow. I've been to St. Petersburg. I was there in 2014. We had organized the vacation before Russia invaded Ukraine the first time. We didn't cancel it. Maybe we should have, but at least I got to see what things were like there at that time. And, for instance, I went to the big department store in Moscow across from Red Square, which is called GUM. And one thing that struck me about that is almost everything for sale in there was imported. I was really interested and curious about what, Russian groceries and products would look like. And I still have no idea because I didn't see any.
Yep. 100%.
They import everything. Anything that's, reasonably well made doesn't come from Russia.
Yeah.
There's a joke about the only things that they ever made that worked were the AK-47 and maybe RPGs. And that's because they had to compete militarily with products from outside the country.
Yep. Maybe some forms of step concrete, but other than that, there's just not much that they've ever produced. And actually, I was thinking about this when you're talking about the cultural appropriation, when you're talking about it's a couple 100-year, people look at a map, they might not understand how huge Russia is or why it's so huge. It was a couple 100-year process that they took over all that land. And yeah, there were many indigenous peoples that they took over, wiped out, as you mentioned. But again, in the back of my mind, and I know this is going through our listeners' minds and many libertarians' minds, you have this whataboutism, and let's talk about, all the crimes that Americans did, and let's talk about the Native Americans, let's talk about Jim Crow laws, let's talk about slavery. And I will, if you have any thoughts, please do. But one of the things that I always like to say here is, obviously, you can always come back with these sorts of arguments and say, these people were men of their times. The founders, Jefferson knew that slavery was wrong, but he still had it, and he didn't see a way to stop it at the time when he was writing. And you can make these sort of defenses of the founders. But I don't even think you need to do that. I mean, you can always say that we're trying to be a more perfect union, or as Lincoln said, or a better free market society, a better liberal society, improve liberalism, improve markets. I think generally that's what America is about. And yes, there are black spots there, 100%, just as there are black spots with every nation or even colonial nation, if you want to say this. But one of the things that people really don't understand about what happened with Russia, and maybe you can touch on this, is or the state of Russia, is that they've never had any reformation. They've never had any liberalization of their economy. They went from a czarist, imperialist, peasant economy 100 years ago to the worst ideology you can possibly have, a Bolshevist, Marxist, Leninist revolution. They killed all the kulaks, the landowners. They killed all of the royal family, replaced with just despotism. Stalin comes in, millions die. They killed millions of Ukrainians under the Holodomor. And then all of a sudden after World War II, because they helped defeat the Nazis, thanks as well to the U.S. Lend-Lease program, yes, they did lose a lot of lives on the East after 3 years of already siding with the Nazis in 1939, 1940, and 1941. Probably, most certainly would have continued on siding with the Nazis had Hitler not double-crossed them in Operation Barbarossa. Nonetheless, after World War II, they find themselves in this sort of privileged position in the world. They go on for 50 more years as just disastrous basket case place, which the best thing you can know about a Soviet family is that the children are going to grow up worse than their parents. That's what happened in the Baltics. The Baltics were free. Pre-World War II, the children grew up worse than their parents. So all these things happened under Soviet Russia. And then you have the 90s, where they were given a chance again. They were given a chance to liberalize, to reform. Western capital came in. They tried to retool the space race into something good. All of these things. And so I always push back at anybody who wants to try to put nuance here, or say Putin's really doing the best for their people, or he's a strong man, or all the rest, is Russians haven't just done things wrong in a little way. I mean, they've done things wrong in a big way, and at some point they're going to have to internally answer to that. But until then, they are attacking sovereign nations, deporting children. I don't know any other way to put it to say that they are not a net positive to society at all. And it does not mean that you, as a liberal, free market economy, especially someone who wants to look out for our allies, that you just stand off and let them just bastardize another generation of Ukrainians. So there's a lot there. Again, Tim, what would you say to that?
Well, one thing I would say is I'm part Native American myself, a very small part, but more than Elizabeth Warren. My family ancestry goes back to the Mohawks of the northern New York Black River Valley. And, I think one big difference between Native Americans and African Americans and a lot of the peoples that the Russians dealt with is that there's still some of us left. Like the Circassians, who I mentioned, were almost completely wiped out. Like 95% of them were killed, and not by disease. A lot of the people in the Americas that died off after European contact died from diseases that the Europeans didn't really understand yet either. They weren't actively, killed and massacred. Um, as you may know, Russia even had owned Alaska at one time before we bought it from them, and there's a monument in Alaska to the Russian governor. I think it's on Sitka Island, where the natives there absolutely hated him because he basically enslaved them and killed a whole bunch of them, and used them to trap seals for their fur, so the seal furs could be shipped back to Russia and sold. Um, so there's yes, African Americans were treated horrendously for a long time, but there's a lot of them left. They're not all gone. I think that's a huge distinction to be made here. And we really did try hard to do better by them. And in a lot of ways, we have. I don't even think that process is fully complete. I think we have a lot of racist policies here in America today that most people are in denial about their racism, like zoning. And everyone, a lot of people go, zoning, what's racist about that? I don't get it. Big discussion, off topic, but you're absolutely right that Russia, there's no real comparison. I mean, one of the real illuminating things I read about this a long time ago was how in Russia there's never been even any separation between church and state. And that's one of the most fundamental separations of powers in Western history, but not Russian history. Russia's not Western in a very fundamental way. Russia adopted Orthodox Christianity from the Byzantines when Byzantium collapsed. The Byzantine Empire didn't have separation of church and state either. The church was a department of the state. That's how it is in Russia. They have essentially a department of religion in practice, if not exactly in name. As a religion, a lot of the 19th century anarchists like Bakunin wrote things like, God and the State, where they basically portrayed religion, Marx also, as, the opiate of the masses, the mere ideological rationalization for the power of the state. Well, that's a very literally accurate description of Russia, both in that time and pretty much ever since. The actual content of the ideology has changed. They went from Orthodox to communist and then kind of sort of back to Orthodox with, whatever bits of communism they feel convenient, still brought back in whenever they think they need to. But that fundamental societal structure has never really changed.
If anything, it's more weaponized than ever. Most people perhaps don't know that Kirill the Patriarch, he was a KGB. I mean, he's a bona fide KGB agent that's known.
Yes.
The Russian church in Ukraine is being weaponized and has been directly taken on head on. And again, another thing I just find so disturbing is it's an offhand comment for libertarians to say, oh, well, look at how they just censor these churches. They just, shut down these Russian churches in Ukraine. That's an act of war that Russia is actively pursuing against Ukraine, using the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, which is different, by the way, than the Ukrainian branch. And it's
right.
It's actively being used against them. And this, by the way, is the same thing that perhaps people remember the band Pussy Riot and the controversy with them around the Sochi Olympics. This was all about the weaponization of the Russian Orthodox Church in society. This has been happening for a long time. It's nothing new. It's just in hyperdrive right now.
Yeah, I would liken it to the German-American Bund in America during World War II. It was ostensibly an organization of just, German Americans who were patriotic about their home country, but it was being funded by the Nazis. It was being used by the Nazis. It was recruiting for the Nazis. It was agitating for them. And, we actually heard some stuff from, people that hung out around Rothbard in the 50s, 60s, 70s that described the suppression of these groups as Germanophobia. irrational fear of Germans or Germany. Oh, people are afraid of Nazis. Gee, I wonder why. And then we hear similar things about Russophobia today. Gee, why would anyone be afraid of Russians? Well, let's see. Russia starved millions of Ukrainians to death in the 30s, just to name one example.
Just to name one.
Yeah. They deported tons of people from the Baltics. When I was in Vilnius, I went to the museum they made there of the old KGB headquarters. And it's not the same as a Holocaust museum. I went to that one in Kaunas, and that one, absolutely made me cry. But that KGB museum now, they've got rooms in there filled with the remains of victims of the Soviets that are yet to be identified. They don't know who those bodies were. They don't know who their families were. They're still working on that. That's the kind of legacy that we have from all those decades of Russian occupation. I thought I was being original a while back when I described the 90s as Russia's Weimar period. Then I found out that other people had said the same thing. After World War I, Germany had an opportunity to liberalize and become democratic, and then Russia had that opportunity in the 90s, and it basically all ended when Putin took power in 1999. And to give him credit, Yuri Maltsev had Putin's number right from the start because he saw what Putin did in Chechnya. They crushed Chechnya. The Chechens didn't want to be part of Russia. They, had been genocided by Russia before more than once. And he had reinvaded Chechnya and killed hundreds of thousands of people to crush all resistance and set up a puppet dictator there. Why anyone would think that Putin was the least bit friendly to freedom after that. That was all, starting in 1999 and a few years after that, it's just nonsense. You mentioned property rights. So private property has never really been restored in Russia. It was in Ukraine. Ukraine had land reform to where the point, I think, almost all of the agricultural land in Ukraine is privately owned now. And that's not true in Russia. There was never any, reprivatization of agricultural land in Russia. It just didn't happen. They didn't do it. Not a priority for them.
And you mentioned Yuri Maltsev, one of the great Austrians that I wish I had had the chance to interview before he died. It's very evident what happened with the Chechen wars, what Putin was doing as he was prime minister for the second one. But when he came in, when he was appointed by Yeltsin, it took him less than a year to shut down Boris Berezovsky's channel, independent media channel, and then Gusinski's channel, NTV, the next year, and took down Mikhail Khodorkovsky, biggest oil oligarch in Russia, a year or so after that. So from the very beginning, there was, like you said, there's no property rights, there's no markets, there's no courts, people act like this is somehow, a normal democracy going to defend its rights. It's not. It's an absolute autocratic, dictatorial, continuous of a just putrid, nasty Bolshevik time entity that is the Russian state, which, if it's going to claim any glory, it's the Russian Empire, which is just even worse than that. The same people that introduced the Pale of Settlement, the same people that, there's just nothing there. There's literally nothing there. When I say, what have Russians done for humanity? Like, I don't mean it in a little way. I mean it in a big way.
Yeah, there was an old book on this that I never read, but I've been meaning to get a copy of it. It was called East minus West equals zero. And the basic thesis of it was written by a German historian. The basic thesis of it is that Russia has been, importing culture and technology from the rest of the world, and sometimes or often at gunpoint. They got their religion from the Byzantine Empire. virtually all Russian technology is imported. They were stealing enormous amounts of it from us. There's a great story I read in a book about the Cold War about the how the Russians were stealing embedded chips to control oil and gas pipelines from us. And we found out about it from French intelligence, and we set them up with a Trojan horse. We arranged it so that the chips they stole were ones that were rigged to fail in such a way as to cause a pipeline explosion. And that happened. If they had their own industrial base, really, I've been reading a lot about World War II and Lend-Lease, and we essentially gave them, everything they could possibly need during World War II to keep their military production going. Stalin actually shut down the Comintern at that time because he realized he didn't need it. He was getting everything he wanted from us anyway, so why bother? We gave them all sorts of things, food, machine tools, radios, trucks, locomotives for their trains, all kinds of things. And they've been in denial about it ever since. They claim, oh, we fought the Nazis all by ourselves. Well, first you funded them. And then afterwards...
First you completely allied with them.
Yeah, you helped.
You gave them the iron ore for their tanks, as you say.
You divvied up Eastern Europe between yourselves and them, and gave them all the fuel they could possibly want to fuel their tanks as they invaded Western Europe, and then you gave them, tons of food and everything else you had. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right that there's a fundamental disconnect between the sort of impression that Westerners have of Russia as being a Western country like the rest of Europe, or even, comparable to the United States or Canada, North America, the Americas in some way. It's just not. They did a very good job of appropriating, art, music. They had their own theater, but they never had anything that would actually challenge the power of the state in Russia in the way that it happened here in the West and in the United States. And I would ultimately, again, put that down to, I think the most fundamental one is the separation of church and state, because the church in the West is this very powerful force and organization that has a lot of moral authority. It doesn't really matter which church it is. I'm an atheist, but I have to respect the force of, religious belief in history because it's a very real thing. It's a big factor in people's lives. They care a lot about it. And, there was a line by Stalin where he was told, how the Pope didn't like communism. And he said, well, how many divisions does the Pope have? That's their kind of attitude about it. They don't really care about the force of conscience like that, or morality.
Yeah. And it's if you pay attention, it's right there in front of you. It's brutal. There's no falling to sort of common sense or reason, or not even talking about property rights, but just the worldview of Putin really is indeed as it was for Stalin and the rest of the crazies. Like, it really was a game of might makes right. And then once the U.S. actually, you had another good quote here, a good expose you can elaborate on. Once the U.S. under Reagan in particular actually took the Russians on in this arms race, which the U.S. really wasn't even caring that much about in a direct way, let's say, until the 80s, and things really did get hot in the 80s, nuclear wise, but just in every other reason. I mean, in every other way, the U.S. showed that the dynamic manufacturing and market-based power of a liberal economy was just, the communists were no match for it in the 80s. And that's another reason what brought them down is, we could really see that the emperor had no clothes.
Yeah, and so I think the way I would start with that is that you will find the view amongst a lot of, let's say, dovish libertarians on the Cold War that because socialism is, non-feasible economically, that it was only a matter of time, according to them, that the Soviet Union would, of course, eventually collapse. And in some ways, that might have been true if we really isolated the Soviet Union from all trade, but we didn't. We traded with them quite a bit. We gave them a huge amount of technology,
bailed them
and
out
industry.
all the time.
Yeah, exactly right. So I would say after World War II, even though we didn't lose anywhere near as many people as the Soviets did in World War II, we still realized it was an incredibly expensive effort. We spent about a third of our GDP on defense. We were running deficits that were about the same size. 33% of GDP was the deficit in World War II at its height. We didn't want to spend that much money on defense ever again if we didn't have to. Eisenhower figured out after he became president that the cheapest bang for the buck in military power was nuclear weapons. So he reoriented our defense policy to be one primarily based on a massive nuclear deterrent. The policy was called massive retaliation. And that had its advantages and disadvantages, but one of the things about it was that after the Soviet Union got nukes on its own in 1950, that was an area where we could basically try to operate at parity with the Soviet Union, the idea being, they can't nuke us because we can nuke them too. And that allowed us to not spend as much money as we would have had to if we were trying to deter them with conventional military forces also. So there was a decision made back in Ike's time to keep the U.S. defense budget down by not trying to match the Soviets in conventional forces. It's very expensive to do that. So we had a tripwire defense in Germany. A lot of people don't realize that. Russia goes on about how, the U.S. has, NATO has bases in Europe. They could invade us. We never had invasion forces in Western Europe, even at the height of the Cold War. Hitler needed, about 3 or 4 million people to invade the Soviet Union, and he still lost.
Yeah.
We never had that many people.
And still do not. Still
don't. Yeah, they go on about how, there were missiles. We have
that's a big point.
Yeah, they're interceptors. They have no warheads. Their sole purpose is to shoot down incoming missiles from Russia. We literally couldn't launch a missile attack on Russia from those countries if we tried. Those missile bases have been inspected by the Russians. They know what's there. They know that there's no offensive missiles there at all. There's just none. They don't exist. Russia, meanwhile, has Iskander missiles in Kaliningrad, which is a little enclave, or exclave, actually, of Russia. It's not connected to Russia. It's separated from Russia by Lithuania and Belarus. But it's Russian territory. It used to be Königsberg. It was part of Germany. They have nuclear-capable missiles there that are IRBMs, intermediate range ballistic missiles, and they've never been inspected. We don't know if they have nuclear warheads or not. Maybe they don't. I hope they don't. But, Russia has these things that supposedly justify invasion to make sure they're not there anymore. We're not invading Kaliningrad. We're not doing anything about this. And yet, Russia has this double standard. They get to do it, and not only does nobody else get to do anything like that, but they get to, blow up exaggerated claims about what's actually happening that just aren't true.
It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. I want to take it back to a concrete thing from one of your articles about Rothbard. Again, we'll link to all this in the show notes. But I want to read something that Rothbard wrote that you, again, just destroy because it's just so laughable. Yeah. So Rothbard wrote, this is World War II, talking about the World War II. The Hitler-Stalin Pact, much reviled by the uncomprehending Western press, actually made excellent sense for both major, quote, revisionist post-Versailles powers, Germany and Russia. For the essence of that pact was the commonality of revisionist interest by both powers. From that pact, Germany got its lost territories back, plus an extra chunk of ethnically Polish Poland, and Russia peacefully reacquired its old territories with the exception of Finland. Again, what we talked about earlier, that it doesn't even mention the Baltics by name, but we must just qualify as an old territory, even though if it's important to libertarians to have a big state, we certainly had big states, Polish, Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, but he doesn't seem to think that's worth meriting. And his positions on Finland and Poland doesn't seem to be worth mentioning, I should say. And his positions on Poland and Finland are just as laughable. So,
yeah. In fact, describing the Soviet invasion and occupation of Poland in 1939 as peaceful is horrendously bad. It's the sort of thing that's so awful you have to laugh, because otherwise you'd have to cry. I mean, the Soviets killed people in Poland faster than the Nazis in the early stage of the war.
yes.
In fact, I came across a quote recently that the Soviets were so good at deportations that the Nazis were really impressed. They were like, wow, we have a lot to learn from these guys. You know?
And they did. And they
did.
did.
They absolutely did. They took it seriously. In fact, I came across a quote from Rothbard a while back where he was not only praising the Hitler-Stalin Pact, but he was praising another treaty in the early 1920s between Russia and Germany. I think it was called the Treaty of Rapallo, where he was saying, this is another great pro-peace thing. Well, this is an arrangement where Germany was going to circumvent its arms restrictions from the Treaty of Versailles by doing all their military R&D in Russia. So they had collaboration going on between a bunch of German military officers who went to Russia in the 1920s, and that's where they did all of this R&D for their tanks and other weapons and fighters and bombers. And what the Russians got out of it is they got access to all of that technology. So this is how the Russians, managed to go from being, this horrendously backwards backwater to, a fully motorized, industrialized army in World War II. They had help from the Germans up until the point that Hitler took power. Hitler stopped it, but Rothbard's praising this as some sort of pro-peace treaty. It wasn't a peace treaty at all. It was a treaty for the purpose of developing their military power again. I mean,
fully dividing Central Europe between themselves.
Yeah, precisely, exactly. And they hadn't figured out exactly what they were going to do with all that military capability before, but it was basically an arms production agreement.
And to describe, the revisionist nonsense that he tries to do here, like, I like how you talk about it. He says that the Germans got back a chunk of ethnically Polish Poland. He's acting like this is somehow German lands that were once Germany, that it's right that they had them back. No, it was actually Poland. It was always Poland. He's acting like that somehow there's just Poles living on this land. It's actually Poland with Poles living on it because it's Polish land. It's sovereign land, post-Versailles Treaty, and even pre-Versailles Treaty. It was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Of course, you have to go back 100 years before World War I. But regardless, Rothbard's statute of limitations seems to only start post-Versailles Treaty, post-September 1st, 1939, always after the aggressor makes the move. And there's just so much wrong with it. I'll let you go.
So what I was going to say to that was, I had a thought there a moment ago.
About the Poles.
Yes, right, exactly. What's especially ironic about all of this stuff is that Ludwig von Mises got all of this stuff right. And Ludwig von Mises was Rothbard's teacher. And Rothbard loved to present himself as the most Misesian of all the Misesians, and he really wasn't. If you read Omnipotent Government or some of von Mises' other books, what he says about these things is that, of course, the Polish corridor was always Polish. Danzig was a free city. Yes, it was German, but it went back to the thing we call the Hanseatic League. Hansa in German means league, so we're really saying it's the League. But it was this string of German cities along
The Baltic.
the Baltic, going all the way to at least Klaipėda, which is now in Lithuania, that I've also been to. But they weren't connected to Germany ever. Or if they were, it was a really long time ago, and the people around them weren't German. They were other peoples. It was Germany's great big colonial project going back a long time. Even before the unification of Germany itself. So really, you couldn't call it German in the sense of a German state. It was more like Holy Roman Empire. It's stuff. But at any rate, you're absolutely right. And Mises knew this because he was Austrian, although actually he was from this town that's now part of Ukraine. We call it Lviv. It's I think it was called Lvov at one time, depending on which language you speak, how you pronounce it.
Lvov is the Russian name. Let's leave that out. Let's call it Lviv.
Yeah, Lviv. I'm happy to call it that. I read a lot of World War II history, so in those books it's called Lvov. But there's a big problem there where a lot of times when you're reading about World War II and they're talking about Russia, they're actually talking about countries. They're talking about the Soviet Union, which included a lot of countries that are not Russian.
Indeed.
But yeah, Ludwig von Mises got this stuff right, as well as his overall foreign policy prescription for Russia, where he basically says we should leave Russia alone. Let them have Russia and Russia only. And at the time he was writing this, the Soviets had not yet reacquired the Baltics, I think. Maybe they had. It's not completely clear. It's either 40 or 43. I forget which. One of those. But again, leaving them alone.
They were actively being destroyed by both the Soviets and the Nazis.
Yeah, exactly. But leaving, to me, if you want to advocate non-intervention and isolationism here with a country ruled by an aggressive imperialist dictator like Russia, that means you don't subsidize it, you don't trade with them. And we've been doing that since, in one way or another, since Roosevelt recognized them in the early 1930s, in 1933. At the time, in the Great Depression, Roosevelt thought that, hey, there was a lot of money to be made by trading with Russia, so let's do that, and maybe it'll help us get out of the Depression. Well, it was a bad idea from the start. And to bring it back to what you were saying about, Reagan bringing down the Soviet Union, Reagan was the first American president after World War II that decided to challenge the Soviets across the board of the military spectrum. We had a massive conventional defense buildup. We were investing in new technology like the Star Wars program or missile defense programs. The Strategic Defense Initiative is what it was called. And maybe that was a bit of a bluff, but on the other hand, we've been seeing missile defense work quite well in recent years in both Ukraine and Israel. So maybe there was more to it than we thought. Star Wars was a disparaging nickname given to it by Ted Kennedy. But also we saw the superiority of U.S. military technology over Soviet technology in a number of places around that time. There was an air war over Lebanon, the Bekaa Valley, that was known as the Bekaa Valley Turkey Shoot, in which a bunch of Israeli-piloted U.S. fighter jets destroyed virtually every single MiG that the Syrians had. So that proved that the MiGs were no match for us. In the Gulf War, Saddam had the best Soviet tanks that there were, and we just destroyed them willy-nilly. The highway between Kuwait and Iraq was known as the Highway of Death because we just destroyed so many of them. We took very few casualties ourselves there. And as we've seen also recently, our decades-old military surplus equipment has been just destroying the best stuff that Russia has to throw at Ukraine. The Patriot missile batteries have been performing wonderfully. And it's not even that this buildup by Reagan bankrupted the Soviets necessarily. When Yeltsin took over, he said that they had enough resources still on hand to have lasted at least another 10 years. But what we really did is we defeated them in the sense that they knew they would never be able to beat us. They could have lasted a bit longer, but there was no point. So they gave up, basically. Not everybody agreed with that decision, but essentially that's what ended up happening. So I think this refutes the notion that the isolationists or anti-interventionists, as they like to be called, have of, the Soviet Union was just always going to collapse. Mm-hmm. Well, they were saying this all the way back in the late 40s.
Yep.
And it didn't for another 50 years until finally somebody said, okay, we're going to make it happen. What do we need to do across the board to make it happen now? And that's what Reagan did, and it worked.
Yep. Very good point. And again, just to reiterate, in case people sort of didn't connect that thread from what I asked earlier, I mean, it was a literal, that was the real arms race that started with Reagan. That was where they realized coming into the modern era of the 80s, they couldn't keep up militarily, economically, not at all. Listen, I want to get to the nukes because we've been dancing around that topic, and it's important to the non-intervention. But I want to let's get to that in a second. And a second could still be 20 minutes. Let's see. I want to go back to World War I. Actually, this isn't directly addressed by you. Or Rothbard talks about this in other articles. I can't remember, but I'm just thinking about it now. One of the also common tropes of libertarians or World War I revisionists, or I find libertarians really like this one. Again, whether they like to revise in the favor of Nazi Germany, I'm just not sure. But the idea that the Versailles Treaty was so hard and so difficult, and these people were just so aggrieved that they just had to just stumble upon totalitarianism and Nazism and just the Versailles had to make them as bad as they were. Clearly, it was Versailles. There's a very big wrinkle in this, and it's if you look at another country that was on the winning side of World War I, and that is fascist Italy. Italy, at the beginning, was actually against the Allies, but then they switched sides, and they were a winning side, a winner part of the Versailles Treaty, and they are one of Hitler's role models for fascism. So do you have any thoughts there about this whole idea of how we just caused Nazi Germany? I mean, it's all the West's fault. It's the same thing.
Yes, I agree. I completely agree, and I can add a lot to that, I think. I've been wanting to write an article about this, but I haven't put all the pieces together because I haven't read enough books on it yet. But again, Ludwig von Mises has got this one right also, where he basically said the real problem with the Treaty of Versailles is that it wasn't enforced. But to go back to the question of whether or not it caused the rise of Nazism, you're absolutely right. The first country to go fascist was Italy, and Italy was a victor in World War I. In fact, there's a great old book that the Rothbardians used to recommend that I read called As We Go Marching by John T. Flynn, where he does an analysis of the causes of fascism, and I think it still holds up quite well, even though it was written either in the 40s or 50s. And he starts out with fascist Italy. And, you read about it, Italy was not subject to the Treaty of Versailles at all. Another good example here is Austria. Austria didn't go Nazi. Austria had to be invaded and annexed by the Nazis, even though Austria was also subject to the Treaty of Versailles.
Correct.
And, lost an enormous amount of territory because of that. They did get a dictatorship, but they weren't aggressive. They didn't invade anyone. They had to be annexed by Hitler so that Hitler could then, have them jump on his bandwagon. And they did so, but, again, left to their own devices. So the other thing here is to bring in as a connection here is the hyperinflation in Weimar Germany of 1923, which is also blamed on the Treaty of Versailles. So the argument goes that the Treaty of Versailles singled out Germany for causing the war. It didn't. It had a war guilt clause where it referred to the countries that started the war. It didn't say Germany and Germany only started the war. The claim is that the reparations payments imposed on Germany were really huge. They weren't. What ended up happening is that we loaned Germany the money to make the reparations payments. And Germany never paid the loans back until long after World War II. So Germany, West Germany really, after World War II, said, okay, we're going to be a good international citizen as a country now, and we're going to make reparations payments like we were supposed to after World War I. They also decided to make reparations payments to Holocaust survivors. Holocaust deniers have argued that the Holocaust was fabricated in a way to, get those reparations payments out of Germany, but that's just not true.
Let's bracket it. We should touch on it because Harry Elmer Barnes and some other just despicable characters somehow
I'll get
find
there.
their way.
I'll get there.
The Rothbard orbit. Yes.
But the Treaty of Versailles. So another irony here is that the biggest early critic of the Treaty of Versailles outside of the German-speaking world itself was John Maynard Keynes. And oddly enough, this is like the only thing Keynes ever wrote that the Rothbardians have something good to say about. On everything else, they're like, oh, Keynesianism is awful, it's bad, it's wrong, it's terrible. But boy, was he right about Versailles.
Yeah.
They don't even necessarily want to admit that Keynes was the originator or popularizer of their argument, but he was. And the other thing here is that Germany was actually, after 1923, Germany was stable until the Great Depression began. Germany was doing fine. It wasn't the greatest country in the world, but it wasn't the worst either. There was no threat of either a Nazi or communist takeover in Germany back then. When the Great Depression began, things started to fall apart again because the economy started doing so poorly. And both the communists and the Nazis started doing well at that time. And it sort of became a bit of a binary choice for Germans. In the last free election held before Hitler took power, I think the Nazis and the communists got about an equal share of the vote. It was something like 33% each. Neither one of them ever got a majority. Hitler had to engage in a lot of maneuvering to get appointed as Führer, as he eventually came to call it.
Another, just a quick aside, another interesting parallel with Putin. They were both appointed first before they took over.
Yeah, right, exactly. These are not democratically elected rulers. They did not represent a majority of the population. Communists have never won a democratic election anywhere ever. It was very similar for the Nazis. Yeah, so I don't think much of this whole argument about the Treaty of Versailles. Now, what did happen back then is that the Germans engaged in a full-out propaganda offensive. There's this common line that you often hear from people about, oh, history is written by the winners. Well, actually, frequently, that's not the case. Usually the winners are too busy winning to write history. The losers are the ones who write history. That's their attempt to win the war after the war. Even Churchill wrote his history of the Second World War after he had failed to get reelected. So the German Foreign Ministry formed a department called the War Guilt Department, the Kriegsschuldreferat. And what it did is it went through the German diplomatic archives from Imperial Germany under the Kaisers, and they sanitized them to remove anything that made it look like Germany was the least bit aggressive towards anyone else. And then they released these archives to a think tank called the Center for the Study of the Causes of the War. It was run by a Swiss-German doctor who was what they call a Volkisch activist. Volk is like the German word for nation.
That's an important word in the formation of fascism. We should come
Yeah,
back to it.
exactly right. So then the connection at Harry Elmer Barnes here is that this think tank that was supposedly independent invited American scholars to come over and study in these archives that had just been released. And one of them was Harry Elmer Barnes. He basically was paid by them to come over and research in there. He wasn't the only one, but he was one of the most, at the time, popular and influential ones. So then he writes a book on the origins of the First World War. I don't think they called it the First World War back then because they didn't know there was going to be another one. And lo and behold, he comes to the conclusion that Germany was not the one that started the war. What do you know? Another big data source here was that after the Bolsheviks took over Russia, they did the same thing with the Tsarist diplomatic archives. They released a bunch of those with the intent of incriminating the Tsarist regime for what it did to start World War I. I think basically World War I was started largely by Russia and Germany.
Definitely.
And so,
Yeah.
Barnes does this research, he publishes this book. His conclusions are Germany didn't start the war, Russia did. And France, because France was allied with Russia at the time. The book gets published, and one of the places where the book gets published the most is in Germany. The German government says, hey, this book is great. We're going to pay for it to be translated into German. We're going to make a textbook out of it in all of our schools. And, this is the book that all our, young German people are going to use to learn about what started World War I. In fact, there's a quote from Hitler saying that Barnes's book is one of the only few good ones about the causes of World War I.
Really?
Yep. Yep. And this book was very influential here in America, too. I'd love to find it again. I read a quote from John F. Kennedy saying that, he thought it was a good book also on the causes of World War I. So, Barnes was very well known back then. He was very popular, very well respected. And I actually used to own a book of his that was on like a general social science. And it was a very good book. It was very well written. He had a lot of, good things to say. It was mostly about stuff that happened before the 20th century, thankfully. But, he was a good writer. He was a well-respected academic back then.
But he tipped at some point to go into
he basically seems to have become I think so. He started out as an advocate, a cheerleader for U.S. entry into World War I, and I think he got disillusioned somehow during the war or right after the war, and he basically reached the opposite conclusion and became as militantly opposed to it as he had been for it beforehand. He was definitely a convert. And he seems to have been, far more sympathetic to Germany, from then on than he really ought to have been. He went on to do some other horrible things, like one of the first Holocaust deniers was this French guy named Razinier, who was a French socialist who had been in one of the German concentration camps that was not a death camp. It was like for political prisoners. As Razinier comes out and says, all this stuff about, German Nazi
gas
extermination camps. Yeah, he says, that's all bullshit. Completely wrong. But the guy that translated them into English was Barnes. Barnes also arranged for them to be published here by the publishing house owned by an American neo-Nazi named Willis Carto. And I just recently came across, believe it or not, you can find it on the web now, there's correspondence between Carto and Rothbard way back in either the 40s or the early 50s, where, they're writing, it's a very friendly correspondence where Rothbard's telling them things like, I love what you do, you're great, here's what I'm up to. And at that time, Rothbard was still friends with Ayn Rand. So he's telling them, Ayn Rand's working on this great new book that's going to be coming out. It's going to be called Atlas Shrugged and stuff. And, these are the people that Rothbard was friends with. These are the people that he respected. Barnes was one of Rothbard's favorite historians. He wrote this, sort of a ode to Barnes after Barnes's death in the 60s, saying what a great champion of truth and freedom Barnes was. I point this out about how, hey, guess what? Barnes was a Holocaust denier. Rothbard liked Barnes. Rothbard also worked with this other Holocaust denier who was a Barnes protege named David Hogan, Hoggan. They worked together at the Volcker Fund in the early 60s, along with Gary North.
North's positions on this are just putrid.
Yeah, they're terrible. And so I even found so I first heard about this from Chris Tame. Chris Tame was the founder of the Libertarian Alliance in England. He owned the only libertarian bookstore in London for a long time. And then he went on to do other things. But I remember Chris Tame telling me before he died, this is back in the 90s or early 2000s, that he had been in a European conference in the 70s where Rothbard was one of the speakers. And in the Q&A, somebody from the audience asked Rothbard about the Holocaust, and he said, oh, that was all made up as propaganda to justify U.S. entry into World War II.
It's incredible.
Yes. And, I believed Chris because I thought this was perfectly in keeping. And I started telling that story again more recently because I got more active on Twitter and I found out people, still had this sort of reverence for St. Rothbard.
It's perhaps growing, yes.
Yeah, and of course, all the Rothbardians went into total denial of this. And I thought it was really funny. One of the things they said about it is, well, Rothbard was very outspoken. So surely, if he had really believed the Holocaust had never happened, then he would have said so, in as many words at some time in his life. And my response to that was, well, if he was so outspoken, then how come he never criticized Barnes for it? He writes this thing saying Barnes is great, Barnes is right, Barnes is wonderful. How come he didn't put in something in there that says except for the Holocaust denial?
Yep.
And it turns out there are other people like the head of the Institute for Historical Review, Mark Weber, wrote an obituary for Rothbard saying Rothbard was one of us. Sam Konkin, who is a founder of Agorism and a friend of Rothbard's, was actually on the board of the Institute for Historical Review. And I knew Sam also.
Can you describe this organization? I mean, it sounds so despicable. I don't know much about it, but I mean...
So, yeah, it was basically an attempt at a Holocaust denial think tank. They had a journal they published. They had a publishing house. It was Willis Carto founded it and ran it, but I think he lost control of it at some point due to some sort of factional infighting between various branches of neo-Nazis. They do that. They had a publishing house called Noontide Press. Another thing is that there was a periodical called The American Mercury. It was originally founded by H.L. Mencken. After Mencken died a while later, some point, Carto acquired that, and that was his publication for a long time. When Barnes translated Rasignier from French to English, got him published by Carto, Barnes also published glowing reviews of those books in Carto's publication, which at the time was the American Mercury. Later on, they either changed the name or changed the publication entirely. At one point, Carto's publication was called The Spotlight, and then I think the most recent incarnation is called the American Free Press. But it's always been a very openly neo-Nazi publication. And I heard stories. I knew people that went to some of these IHR, Institute for Historical Review conferences. So I knew George Smith. I knew Sam Konkin. Konkin was on the board. And George told me stories about how Konkin invited him to one of their conferences, and he went because he was curious. He didn't know anything about it. And he was really shocked and amazed when people in the audience would get up after one of the talks and say, how great they felt to be in an audience of fellow Nazis like themselves, where they could feel free to say what they really thought. And I went, wow, why were you there? Why was Sam on the board? What is the point here? I don't get it. It's just astounding stuff. But I also came more recently across an academic paper. Somebody wrote a history of the early collaboration between Rothbard and North and some of these other people and the
was that in American Jewish History? Johns
Yes,
Hopkins.
I think so.
Yeah, I'll link to that. I read it as well. It's very good. It's very good.
And he
very
basically
detailed.
saying, he not just worked with Hagen, but Hagen was the author of the first attempt at a book denying the Holocaust called The Myth of the 6 Million. Rothbard saw pre-publication versions of it and wrote him, "Hey, this is great stuff." I mean,
did you quote that anywhere? Do you have that quote?
It's in that paper we were just talking about.
Okay.
I haven't written anything on that because most of the stuff I wrote on this was like 20 years ago, and thankfully it's still current, although I'd rather it wasn't in a way. But
it's actually more current than ever. This is what's incredible, and I see this more and more. I would really like to see this paper, what you're talking about. I really see this aggrieved position that libertarians are just. I can think of no other word than just useful idiots putting this out into the zeitgeist that somehow Nazi Germany became Nazis because of the West's and the difficult Versailles Treaty and the Gdansk corridor and all this stuff. Let alone, let's forget the fact that they just modeled themselves after Italian fascists, which actually were on the winning side of World War I. And then applying this same logic to Putin, saying that he's just some aggrieved. He tried open hand out to the West for 24 years of his dictatorship, which really wasn't a dictatorship. And NATO was aggressing against them and all the rest. The parallels are mind-boggling. And if you look at some of these libertarians, it's actually, I think you reached out to me based on a little montage that I did of Dave Smith, of Scott Horton. These guys, I mean, they're apologizing for Putin on a level that is so obscene. It's just so denigrating to the graves of Ukrainians fighting for their freedom at the moment. It's mind-boggling, and the parallels are astonishing.
Yeah, I also think there's a huge element of jealousy and resentment there on the part of the Western, mostly American libertarians. We have this revolutionary heritage. We had a war of independence. A lot of these guys pose as ultra-nationalists, where they sort of re-envision themselves as reincarnations of the Minutemen. And if you read about the Maidan Revolution of Dignity, they did all that recently.
It's unbelievable. They deny it. It's a coup. It was a coup, Tim.
Yeah,
it was a coup.
Exactly. Nonsense. The only people that say that are, either Russian liars or dupes of Russian lies.
I was there. I was at Maidan. Of course, that makes me a CIA agent, according to these people. But I was there.
Getting well paid.
Yeah. I can tell you, and this is so. It's a really important point, I think, to drill home. I know I'm getting on my soapbox a lot this episode, but this is important stuff to me as well over here. I mean, the Maidan revolution is precisely what you said. It really was a revolution of dignity. It's an ongoing revolution of dignity. And look, it's not the first time Ukraine has tried this. Ukraine has had a lot of bloody revolutions before. They've had, we talked about this 4 years where they got smoked out. Their independence movement got smoked out by the Russians from 1918 to 1922. They've been mistreated during the Holodomor, all the rest. But there's, Russia has never been able to control them, and it's no other way to say it. The way that the street signs have changed, the way that the Rada is implementing a lot of Western policies. They've changed the calendar. They're no longer on the Orthodox calendar. They're on more of the Roman Catholic Gregorian calendar, where they're not 2 weeks staggered with their Christmas and New Year. Everything is changed. It's a full-on revolution of dignity. European Maidan is what it was called. And these people are literally pissing on their graves. They think it's a coup. Dave Smith called it a bloody putsch. They have that, they have this call from Victoria Nuland, who I actually want to ask you about. wife of Bob Kagan, who I want to ask you about as well, another neocon luminary. But a little bit goes back to our discussion at the beginning of the Iraq War. I wasn't so fond of the Iraq War. A lot of these libertarians aren't either. I think those guys pushed it hard, but I don't want to rehash. Let's bracket it. I'm getting too carried away with too many different topics. But first of all, Victoria Nuland talking about Yevgeny Yatsenuk, the prime minister that came in at the time. He was in for a matter of months. To say that he was instilled is just an absolute joke. There were multiple parties that were all going against Yanukovych, including the Maidan. The Maidan on the streets of Kiev was a political party that was not leaving the square until their voice was heard. This is a fact. Yeah. It's not the Americans didn't pay for these things to happen. This is a fact that this was a grassroots, on the ground movement on the square of Kiev, the main square, the Maidan Square, that they were not leaving. They were a political force there. So anyway, the point is, the only, if you want to say evidence of American involvement, would be Victoria Nuland handing out cookies at Maidan. Mm-hmm. It would be someone like John McCain speaking on the stage, always very prescient against Vladimir Putin. And his words are ringing more true every day. But there's this call that was leaked, which is somehow she was like setting up the government. It's absolutely not true. Ukrainians are their own people. There's no proof of this. And if her favorite blessed soul Yatsenuk did get in, which he did, he was out in a matter of months. And just like always happens with Ukraine, you're never going to control them. You're never, like, the United States doesn't control them. Russia sure as hell doesn't control them. But what you can say is the figure that they were rebelling against in 2014, when all this started, people forget this is a 10-year-old war, Yanukovych, he is in exile in one country now, and it's not Italy, it's not Syria, it's not Egypt, it is in a multi-million-dollar penthouse in Moscow. This is where he lives. And they ignore it. They just, it's all about, censorship in Orthodox churches, Ukrainians are bad people, they're neo-Nazis. It's lie after lie after lie. Meanwhile, the far right has never had more than 4% in Ukrainian politics ever. It's again, I get on my soapbox again. I had a question here, but I can't even remember what
think I sort of know what it was. You can sort of say it's, what the fuck is wrong with these American libertarians that they don't see all this? The KGB has had this methodology that's called the fire hose of falsehood for decades, where they just spit out lie after lie after lie, and it takes so much time to refute every single one that they basically hope that it'll be too much to rebut them all, and at least some of them will get believed. I certainly, the Nuland thing, I think that was really what your question was about. So she wasn't even talking about getting rid of Yanukovych as president. She was just talking about maybe we need a new prime minister under Yanukovych. And so Yatsenyuk was her choice, preferred choice for a new prime minister, but the prime minister would have been under President Yanukovych. Now, one of the other great things about the Maidan Revolution, in my mind, is that what made Yanukovych finally decide to flee the country? Well, what happened was that some of the activists at Maidan got so fed up that they said they were going to start an armed rebellion. It had been peaceful on their part until then. The Yanukovych thugs had been shooting them, but they hadn't been firing back because they didn't have any weapons. I mean, they actually built a medieval trebuchet so that they could fire something back at the government that was oppressing them, right? Yeah. So what happens when these guys decided they were going to start an armed rebellion, they broke into one of the police armories and they actually got guns for the first time. And that's all it took for this authoritarian dictator, who was the total puppet of Putin. I call him Putin's rent boy. For him to decide, oh shit, I better get the hell out of here. They're going to start shooting back with a few hundred guns. That was all it was going to take.
It was a real revolution, and it wasn't a CIA coup. And another point, the Berkut, which is the Yanukovych's thugs that were firing
Yeah.
on the one day. It was a Tuesday, I believe, after the first full week of the Olympics. It was the main day, was the Heavenly 100, and it was a lot of shooting and killing. This thuggish organization that was part of the Yanukovych Ukraine still exists. And again, people can ask where that Berkut exists now, in what form, where does it exist? It exists in Russia. It continues on in Russia's name. It's now under the Russian flag, Berkut. Like, this is a Ukrainians purged themselves of all of this, of any warring factions or any sort of, everybody was about looking toward Europe. The whole thing about signing the agreement in Vilnius in November of 2013 was about moving towards Europe. It was started by students. It was an Afghani Ukrainian that brought them out to the street on Facebook. I mean, to say these things are a putsch or they're just a bunch of Nazis, a coup, it's all so denigrating to them. And here's another thing, just to go straight to the heart of the non-interventionist bullshit libertarian argument, which I always said it. I've said it on 1,000 shows by now. My listeners are probably sick about hearing it, but I'll say it for you. Is if we talk about the American Revolution, we talk about the decisive battle in Yorktown. Yeah. If I could ask you, Tim, I'm sure you know the answer. Who was the country? Who was the entity that funded the most ammunition, soldiers, ships, life lost during this decisive battle of Yorktown? Was it the American colonies? No, it was France.
If it wasn't for the French Navy, we would not have won that battle, and we are certainly without French support, we would not have won the war.
And this isn't like hyperbole. This isn't trying to be cute. This is reality of liberalism throughout the world. France and America, like it or not, these are the two countries that have pushed liberalism the most, and along with Great Britain eventually when they came back into the fold. That's from our perspective. There's nothing to be cute here about that. I mean, it was absolutely funded by a nation that was, if you want to be jaded, they wanted to push down their foe across the English Channel. But
they wanted revenge for the 7 Years' War, and they were an absolute monarchy at the time.
Yeah, and just to say that like America has always been about non-interventionism, it's always been about those types of ideas, actually flies in the face of everything that America has been about. And if anything, this is something that lots of people have written about this, but from the 13 colonies, America has been nothing but expansionary. I mean,
exactly. How did we get from Boston to San Francisco?
To Alaska.
Yeah. So there was actually, you mentioned
Hawaii.
Robert Kagan. Yeah, you meant in Hawaii and the Philippines also, right? So you mentioned Robert Kagan a little while ago. He actually wrote a very good history of early American foreign policy through the 19th century called Dangerous Nation, which I read and I liked very much.
He's a great mind, by the way. I do think he's a great mind.
Yeah. I don't agree with him about everything, but I think he's got a lot of stuff that is correct that he says.
Yeah.
One of the most interesting points of his that I got out of Dangerous Nation was that this myth of America as a non-interventionist power in the 19th century really came out of the struggle over the spread of slavery. So the expansionists before the Civil War were all the slavers. The reason why we expanded into Louisiana and Florida was because they wanted more slave territory. They had ambitions at one time, the Knights of the Golden Circle, of acquiring Cuba as a slave state, and the Golden Circle in their name referred to the entire rim of the Caribbean all the way through, the northern part of South America. They wanted all that territory as slave states. They even had a private invasion of what is now Nicaragua and Costa Rica before the Civil War. They called it filibustering, where they invaded, and it's still celebrated in Costa Rica as sort of like their Independence Day when they defeated that invasion by Southern slavers. So they were the expansionists back then. The Northerners, there was a Northern non-expansionist or anti-expansionist group mostly in the Boston, Massachusetts area. And their motivation is they didn't want slavery to spread into more territory than it already existed in. But basically, after the Civil War, these factions were basically reconciled, and that's when they both said, okay, we're not going to have slavery anymore, so let's just expand into all the territory that we can. One of the main reasons why there were critics of the Mexican-American War out of the North before the Civil War was that the Mexican-American War basically brought a lot more territory into the Union as slave states, Texas and several others. I don't remember them all right now. And the Marine Corps hymn refers to the halls of Montezuma. That's because in the Mexican-American War, we made it all the way to Mexico City. We didn't stay there. But this notion of, America is non-interventionist, except we, invaded Mexico all the way to Mexico City. We just weren't. It's just not true. It didn't happen. That's not how it was. There was an insurrection in California. That's how we got California, where I grew up.
Hawaii was basically a takeover. I mean, without a fight, but it was a military takeover.
Yeah, it was a military coup. That's how we got Hawaii. Hawaii had been, if anything, affiliated with Britain before that. But we said, no, we want it. It's ours now. Thanks. Yeah. We bought Russia. We bought Alaska from Russia. We did the Louisiana Purchase from Napoleon. Jefferson at the time said this is going to be our great empire of liberty. And the thing that will distinguish it from all the others is that we're going to get it by purchase instead of by conquest. But nevertheless, it was still going to be an empire.
Right. So there are some good examples of economic advancement over just force or whatnot. But actually, this leads me to, I think, balancing these sort of contrasting viewpoints or conflicting viewpoints when it comes to libertarianism and non-interventionism, and thinking about how you just must be beyond principled when it comes to these topics. Let's leave aside the question of nukes still. I want to come to nukes. But if we just talk about what the role is of a state that's promoting liberalism in the world, as the U.S. has been doing generally. It's not true to say that we have been, going back to what we said about with Russia, it's not true that by and large, we have been and dear viewer, listener, if you just turned in, go back and listen to that part we just had during this interview. It's just not true that the United States has gone into a territory, for example, even the Philippines, now an independent country, or Panama. There have been cases where, yes, we might have used force to establish the order as we want to see it, but we have actually followed this idea of the rules-based order. We have followed this idea where it may be America's rules that we create, but we still play by the rules. This is another important point to say. But
well, I can comment on that. I actually know a lot about the Philippines because I take Filipino martial arts, and I've read a lot about the history of the Philippines, especially in World War II, but also the Philippine-American War, which was an offshoot of the Spanish-American War.
Yeah, please do. But just one point to say is I want to try to get it back to our discussion with Russia, and their state just doesn't follow anything like this and has a completely different worldview. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, exactly. But I think this is a good example. So, for instance, in the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, which was a deal between Russia, the U.S., Ukraine, and a few other nuclear powers at that time.
UK, Kazakhstan.
Yeah, exactly. The UK also. So as part of that deal, basically, Ukraine gave up its bombers, it gave up its nukes, and it gave up pretty much anything it had that it could have possibly been used as a military threat to Russia. This is the kind of policy that Russia has towards all its neighbors. There's a joke by a Twitter account named Darth Putin saying that the only secure border in the world is one that has Russian troops on both sides of it. But this is the exact opposite of the type of policy that we had with the Philippines. We conquered the Philippines. Yes, we suppressed a rebellion. I think that the number of casualties in that conflict are usually vastly exaggerated. There were quite a few, mostly to disease again. But aside from that point, I was just watching a military history interview the other day with a guy from the Filipino Air Force who pointed out that right after World War I, we were helping the Filipinos develop their own Air Force. This is unthinkable in most other colonies, most other colonial powers. There's no way you're going to let the locals have their own air power. Russia certainly would not do that. There's another great quote from the Filipino nationalist leader in the 30s where he says, "Damn the Americans, why don't they tyrannize us more?" Meaning that American rule was not bad enough that he could mobilize a whole lot of popular opposition to it. We promised the Philippines their independence in, I believe it was 1936. We said 10 years from now, you're going to be independent. You're going to be fully on your own. And after World War II, we kept that promise. So the Philippines used to be U.S. territory. At the time, interestingly, there were no immigration restrictions between the Philippines and the U.S. If you could afford it, Filipinos could come here. And believe it or not, there were a lot of Filipinos that came over from the Philippines to the U.S. to become professional boxers because they were good at fighting. And their fighting style was very different. If you look at 19th century boxing, it looks very different from modern boxing. And a big part of the reason for that is the Filipino influence. They had a style based on the assumption that you're going to be fighting people that had knives in their hands. So you couldn't afford to just take punches because those punches were going to be cuts or stabs. So you had to avoid the strikes. Anyway, so we gave up the Philippines. We gave them their independence. And in World War II, the Philippines was the only country, certainly in Asia, that was occupied by the Japanese, where there was a significant guerrilla rebellion against the occupiers on our side. All the other countries the Japanese occupied, China put up a big fight too, but China, it wasn't a guerrilla movement, and they weren't on the side of their colonizer because China was not a colony at that time. But in Indonesia, Dutch East Indies, there was no guerrilla movement. There wasn't one in Indochina, Thailand, none of those other countries. But in the Philippines, there was, because they knew that we were going to give them their independence, and they were almost completely self-governing by the time that Japan invaded.
Mm.
So there's a big difference in policy there. This is certainly not how Russia has ever treated any of the territories that it has invaded. Russia has never promised any of them their independence. Russia has never, they've kind of sort of said, oh, you're autonomous, but autonomous means, you're free to do what we tell you.
Yep.
So, yeah, I think there's just a huge difference there. And there's been this massive propaganda offensive by first the Soviets and then, also the Chinese who are still at it, and the Russians have kept it up against the West, saying, the West is bad, the West causes trouble, the West causes all the problems in the world. And this is a case of projection, or camouflaging what you do by accusing your enemies of doing what you do.
100%. And it's all for it is all for domestic consumption, indeed. I think it's one of the reasons why Putin can still somehow not be overthrown. And, tell me what you think of this. I mean, for me personally, my whole libertarian journey, it started around the global financial crisis. And actually, Milton Friedman was a big influence there before I went sort of full down some Austrian rabbit holes. And it's always funny when I find Austrians saying that Milton Friedman's not, libertarian enough, or he's not free market enough. I mean, Milton Friedman has done more for liberty than any economist in the history of the world. There's just no question about it. I mean, he's been so insightful. His Free to Choose series, it's just remarkable. I was talking with one of my Bitcoiner friends recently. We do these quarterly episodes, and he loves it. I mean, it's something he had just started to get into but if you listen to the hardcore Rothbardians, the hardcore Misesians, like militant freedom is just no good, no bueno at all. And so that I find sort of ridiculous. But really, if we're talking about foreign policy, if you're talking, and by the way, with Rothbard's another side tangent, if we're talking free banking versus fractional reserve banking, I mean, I got beyond that Rothbardian view within about 6 months. I mean, to see that free banking was definitely the way to scale versus fractional reserve. But anyway, or free banking / fractional reserve, which is just banking. Anyway, Rothbard seems to think that there were these just wonderful, safe gold vaults in the Middle Ages that every peasant was trying to look to give. That's just not how it worked. That's not how banking works. That's not how things scale.
Yeah, I'm a much bigger fan of Larry White and George Selgin on the history of free banking. I think they basically got it right, and Rothbard painted himself into a corner he couldn't get out of.
Yeah. And, with Bitcoin, I'm on a whole tangent to my question, but with Bitcoin, if you want a full reserved Bitcoin, you can totally do that yourself. You just have to reserve it yourself. You can do it with gold as well. But anyway, another side there. But for me, in my personal evolution of the foreign policy stuff, if I was wavering pre 2014, especially living over here in Eastern Europe, or thinking that this non-interventionism is the way to go and all that, I mean, it changed for me in a heartbeat in 2014, and I think this is something that most libertarians, younger libertarians, people that live in I like to call them the Texas libertarians. I don't even mean it in a pejorative way. Just people that they're very proud to be free. They're proud to be American. I am too. It's great. I happen to have a different worldview, but nonetheless, for me, seeing up close and personal what can happen to your sovereignty, where you have a border treaty. In Ukraine's case, they had a border treaty, multiple border treaties signed throughout the 90s with Russia. Russia violated that in 2014. And then this sort of the reaction from the supposed liberal crowd, liberalism, classical liberalism, libertarianism, to see them sort of shoehorn this sort of, I'm so disillusioned with American foreign policy, let's actually try to understand what this autocrat is doing here. Maybe he's doing something really good. Actually, we like him. Actually, let's forget all of his Nazi fascist gulag tendencies. The fact that he murders journalists and dissidents with plutonium on British soil. Anyway, just the mental gymnastics that they do is so astounding that really for me, and I don't know when in the last 10 years it came for me to realize this, but it's been 10 years, is that there's really just, if we're talking about the world in the 20th century, the 21st century, there's no such thing as non-interventionism. There's just liberalism, there's freedom, and if your friends are asking for help to uphold their and your values and laws and sovereignty, just as we did with the French, I don't see any contradiction there. I don't see any problem. I don't see any lack of principle. I don't see any hypocrisy. But that's the message that they paint towards, I don't know, us, people like you and me, people that just want freedom for Ukraine and democracy. And frankly, I can just say, thank God. I used to say it really stinks that us libertarians were so in the small minority. But now I say, thank God that we are with this view, with this particular view about non-interventionism, because it's so absurdly wrong. And to go to your point about China and Russia versus us and say the Philippines, if we remove ourselves from Eastern Europe, from Central Europe, that vacuum will be filled. And there's no doubt that it's not going to be filled with something that's liberal. So
and also I would argue that we're
another
not going
soapbox rant for me.
Well, yeah, but also we're not going to be able to stay out of it. They have this theory that if we just keep to ourselves, nothing bad will ever happen to us. That's just not true. A lot of them have this sort of view, especially about World War II. Not so much the Cold War, because the Soviets really did have ICBMs and they could have nuked us. But they argue that Hitler basically was only interested in going east, and he didn't really want to go anywhere else. Well, in fact, one of the German weapons programs at the time was called the America Bomber. This was going to be a transatlantic rocket-powered plane whose job was going to be to deliver atomic bombs to the East Coast. And I pointed this out to people, and they said, "Oh, well, yes, but we know all about the German nuclear program, and we overheard Heisenberg and his people talking about what must have happened when we hit Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and we know they were way off." That's true. The Germans had 2 atomic weapons programs. Heisenberg's was only one of them. The other one was run by the SS, and it's still classified. I actually have a personal family connection here. Believe it or not, my grandfather on my mother's side was in Patton's Third Army, very low. He was a mechanic or something. But one of the jobs he got after the war was over was to drive trucks around Germany. So they came to him one day and said, "Hey, there's this German scientist. We want you to drive back to the U.S." Okay. So they get in the truck. They're driving to the coast. The scientist is going to be picked up by one of our subs and brought back here to work for us. The scientist spoke English. They got to talking. The scientist tells him, and he was never told the scientist's name, so he didn't know for a long time after the war. The scientist tells him, "Oh, yes, Germany was within months of completing a new super weapon that would have enabled us to win the war." After Hiroshima, my grandfather understood what he was talking about. Decades later, my grandfather's gone back to rural upstate New York, living his life with his family. They're watching TV. They're seeing a show about, they had one channel on their TV station at that time where they lived. They saw a show about the space program, and there's this German scientist up there talking into the mic, and my grandfather points at the TV and says, "Hey, that's the guy I drove out of Germany." It was Werner von Braun.
Wow.
Werner von Braun was in the SS Rocketry Division.
Yep.
His rockets were going to be the things that were going to deliver the SS's atomic bombs to the U.S. So this whole theory that, if we just stay out of it, nothing's going to happen to us, is just ridiculous.
Yeah, I want to actually, this was a question from my co-host, Alec. He wanted to ask this quote that you wrote in an article. I think you're talking about precisely this. It says, Hitler wrote a second book, which wasn't published during his lifetime, but was discovered by the American historian Gerhard Weinberg after the war, and has since been published. In it, Hitler makes clear his plans for an eventual final military confrontation with America that was to happen in the 1980s after Germany had secured the necessary resources for the job in all that East European Lebensraum he planned to conquer. This timeline seems to have been adopted by the Soviets after World War II, as KGB defectors told us the Soviets planned to attack the USA in the 1980s as well.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. So to elaborate on that, another personal connection, one of my friends who unfortunately just died this year, Stephen Brown, was friends with a British libertarian named Judith Hatton, who was quite old. She started out her career as a cook in World War I. But after World War II, she married a Soviet KGB defector. He was actually from their counterintelligence division, which was known as SMERSH, which is they're the bad guys in the James Bond books. And he once asked her about those, and she said, "Oh yes, those dreadful Bond books," But yeah, the Soviet plan was for a conventional invasion of Western Europe. There was a Polish colonel who figured this out, named Richard Kuklinski. It's actually, I don't know how to pronounce it in Polish, but it's not spelled Richard. It's like RYSZ something. At any rate, he was involved in the Warsaw Pact planning of this because Poland was still part of the Warsaw Pact at this time. And what he figured out was that the only way that the West would be able to stop this Warsaw Pact conventional invasion of the West, it was to use tactical nukes as those forces were crossing Poland. Because West Germany wouldn't let us hit them when they had already made it to East Germany. And, if we didn't hit them before then, it would have been too late. The Poles actually released the plans for this 10, 20 years ago. I forget, somewhere between 10 and 20 years ago. And there are some people who think that that's why the Polish plane with all of the government officials on it blew up a while back. There's a strong theory that that may have been a arranged demolition by the Russians. Can't prove it because the Russians kept the black box and they won't let anybody have it.
Yeah, it was very morbid. I mean, it's going to the Khitan massacre. It was going to the Khitan forest to remember the massacre that the Soviets did. It's very morbid on all.
Yeah, and that's another interesting connection there. So that was primarily of Polish military officers. And before that, Stalin had done the same thing to his own military. He purged the Soviet military officer corps in 1937. I had never heard this until recently, but the reason for that was that in the Spanish Civil War, Stalin had been supporting the Republican side, but there was a rebellion within the Spanish Republican Army from the officers against the Soviets. And that's why they lost, that the Republican side lost in the Spanish Civil War. So Stalin realized that the military officers were a threat to the power of whatever country they were in. So he decided that to secure his power back in the Soviet Union, he needed to purge his own officer corps. And that's why he did that. And again, then when he invaded Poland, that's why he did that to the Polish military. You know, in theory, he could have just taken them over and said, okay, you work for me now, which is what a lot of people says, you know, we should have done when we invaded Iraq. You know, we should have put the Iraqi military to work for us. That's a completely separate topic. But the point is that there's this continuity in methodology between Stalin, what he did at home and what he did abroad. And that's
continuity from Nazism. I mean, from the Nazis.
Yes, yes, exactly. Right. Yeah. One of the things that got me onto this whole, line of research and reading years ago was that, I grew up in Berkeley, California, which is very left wing. And I always used to hear the stuff, the CIA did this, the CIA did that. CIA is responsible for, all these bad things that happened. And at one point, it finally occurred to me, what has the KGB been doing? I've never heard anything about the KGB doing anything. So I started reading up on it, and I realized they did a whole lot. They did at least as much of the CIA, if not a whole lot more.
So what do you say? Another way of asking the questions before. I mean, does two wrongs make a right? Is this, you're just fear mongering? It's not going to be that bad. We need to set a better example. What would you say to these sort of sentiments that are often elaborated by libertarians who don't know what they're talking about when they speak of these issues?
Yeah, when they really don't know what they're talking about. I mean, one of my standard challenges to them is, do you speak the languages of the countries you're talking about? Do you speak Russian? Do you speak Ukrainian? Do you speak Arabic? No, they don't. Do you have any degrees in those topics? No, they don't. Have you read any books about the history of those regions? No, they haven't. But what I say to that kind of thing is I say, let's do, as objective a comparison as we possibly can between the two sides in, let's say, the Cold War. All right. So what are the best and worst countries in the Cold War on the Soviet side, and what are the best and worst countries on the U.S. side? So on the Soviet side, the worst would be someplace like Khmer Rouge, Cambodia, where a quarter of the population was mass murdered, about 2 million people. The worst on the U.S. side would be probably someplace like Indonesia within the Asian region, where a coup by the communists was thwarted, and the dictator Suharto is estimated to have killed about 500,000 people out of a much larger population. So the body count is much lower in absolute terms, and it's much, much lower as a percentage of the population. Plus Indonesia finally made a transition to democracy after Suharto died, and it's much better off now. Cambodia still hasn't. It's very poor. It's been starting to make some recovery, but only after the Soviet Union collapsed. Vietnam, similar story there. And if we look at the best examples, Yeah, the best examples of regimes under the Soviet Union or under communism were the ones that were the least communist. Like in Poland, they never collectivized agriculture. That's why they never had a famine due to collectivization of agriculture in Poland. They were going to, they tried, but in 1956, there was a revolt by the Poles where they basically met the Red Army at the border chanting Katyn, or however you pronounce it, the massacre we were just talking about. And the
Yep.
Red Army said, no, we're not doing this. We saw how they fought against the Nazis, in Warsaw in 1940, was it 44? Like, they're not going to give up. They're not going to quit. Similarly, in Hungary, the Hungarian Revolution was against the Soviets in 1956 also, right after that. And at that point, the Soviets, they did crush the revolution, but they also said, we need to ease up on this country. We need to not be so onerous there. So they desocialized the economy somewhat after that point. So I just think, you have to make these types of comparisons. Yes, I was talking to a friend of mine about this once, and what she said in response is, it's the difference between, getting some blood on your hands and being, up to your neck in it with the blood of your victims. There's just a huge, huge difference in degree that's so big as to really be a difference in kind.
Yeah, and there's, I think as well, this should be said, there's very sad and suspicious side, this sort of revisionist side that seems to be taken unbelievably by folks like Rothbard as well with Jewish heritage. That, you're often in this weird way siding with some of the most egregious Holocaust deniers, people that just apologists for Germany. Again, we don't have to rehash the history we just talked about, but apologists for an aggressive, dictatorial, murderous Nazi regime that, of course, the people that suffered the worst were the Jews. And I cannot imagine how you could possibly try to revise that or be a contrarian or take the other side in that debate.
Yeah, it's pretty mind-blowing, really, when you realize what's going on here. It's amazing, and it's hard to believe, but it's clearly what they're doing. It's clearly what's happening. I think there's just this real blind spot. As you said, libertarians are this tiny minority. It can be very alienating. We can feel like, we don't really fit in with the societies that we live in a lot of ways. And, we sort of end up associating with people that feel the same way. And we may not necessarily realize that, a lot of the other people that are just as alienated as we are alienated for very different reasons. And, somebody's alienated from America because they think we really should be a lot freer than we are. Taxes are too high. We have, too many restrictions on, prostitution and drugs and gambling and, guns, whatever. That's very different from saying, we're alienated because the whole country is run by the Jews and they control the media and Hollywood and they're all trying to enslave us and, they all want to make us in debt for the rest of our lives. There's just enough overlap there for some people to think that you can make common cause, right? A lot of it comes up when you get into analyzing the banking system, the monetary system. There's real problems there, and then there's a lot of money cranks out there.
Yeah.
The money cranks try to say, well, we're just like you, or you're just like us, you're one of us. I heard a description once of people who were encountering this when they went to the conferences for the Ludwig von Mises Institute, which they really should give the name back because they don't deserve it. And they were describing the sales pitches. Yeah, come for the free market economics, stay for the racism.
Who said that? This is like people.
People who had been
word of mouth type stuff.
Exactly right. Yeah, that was the line about it. I forget the guy who said that, but that was their description of it. And then you glom onto other people like the neo-Confederate apologists who want to say the South was right in the Civil War. And I live in the South now, and I like it, and I think it's better in a lot of ways than other parts of the country, but not because of the legacy of slavery.
Right.
That's not the part about it that I like. That's not the good part.
Let me let's finally get to the nukes, Tim.
Yeah, sure.
This is all very interesting stuff. One of the longer episodes we've recorded, actually. We talked about non-interventionism, how, in our view, it's probably, it's not only naive, but just could be dangerous for yourself and for your allies. I completely agree with that. At least that's my conclusion after, nearly 20 years of between libertarianism and all these different branches of conservatism or whatever. But of course, the big one, and I've seen this many times on Twitter, respond to people like this. The big one is, well, Russia just has a lot of nukes. And my understanding of their view is basically, look, we know it's wrong. We wouldn't want to be in the Ukrainian position. It's really sad for them. But look, they're in Russia's sphere of influence. Russia has nukes. It's too bad for them. Let's stop the bloodshed. Let's let them sue for peace. And Russia has nukes. So what do you say to that type of a narrative?
Well, what I would say is that they're forgetting one of the basic laws of economics, which is that if you incentivize behavior by rewarding it, you get more of it. So if you cave into nuclear blackmail, you're going to get more nuclear blackmail. And their notion that Russia just wants Ukraine back and will stop there, or just wants the old Russian Empire back and will stop there.
Very Rothbardian notion, yes.
I think it's very, very woefully misguided. Honestly, why would you stop there? I've just been reading a new book about the history of the Cold War, and in the early days after World War II, Russia wanted Libya because it was a former Italian colony. Libya is not connected to the Soviet Union in any way, not connected to Russia in any way. Russia's been actively involved in Syria, helping Assad mass murder Syrians in the Syrian Civil War, which is a lot like the Spanish Civil War in a lot of ways.
Yep.
Russia's been active in Cuba. A lot of people don't know this, but the terrorist group that holds the record for the highest number of bombings inside the United States was run by Cuban intelligence in the 70s. It was the Puerto Rican nationalists. So,
is that record still held? Do you know?
Sorry?
Is that they still hold that record?
Yes.
Taking a moment to remind you that this show is brought to you by Trezor, home of the original Bitcoin hardware wallet. For over 10 years now, Trezor means business in Bitcoin security and functionality. When using their wallet software Trezor Suite to connect to the Bitcoin network, you're automatically connected via Tor, protecting your identity and giving you full control of your coins in a fully open source manner, both on the software level and on the hardware level. So head on over to Trezor.io to grab your brand new Trezor Safe 5 with a secure element, as well as a ton of available accessories to back up your keys and keep your coins safe.
Yeah, no, the whole notion that we can stay out of it. I have a family friend who's of Russian descent. He's a direct descendant of Alexander Herzen, who was a famous Russian 19th century intellectual. He worked for a company that was selling medical devices and exporting them to the Soviet Union from California. In the 90s, the Russian mafia came to visit his office while he was out of town and extorted them at gunpoint. So this theory that, if we just let Russia do what it wants and have what it wants, we can stay out of it, is just nonsense. They were hunting down Russian emigres in Paris and in New York and in London back in the 20s. Trotsky was assassinated in Mexico.
Yep.
In the 30s. This is the kind of thing they do. They've always done. You mentioned, they've killed people with polonium in London.
Yep.
They tried to kill people with nerve gas in Britain. One of the things that Yeah, one of the things that annoyed me way back when was when the Orange Revolution happened in Ukraine. The leader of it was poisoned by the Russians, and the crowd over at antiwar.com was saying, "Oh no, it wasn't dioxin. He's just an alcoholic. These are symptoms of alcohol poisoning." This stuff is nonsense. And the guy who said that, John Laughlin, was a regular at antiwar.com, but his employer was a think tank in Paris that was funded by Russia. He also founded his organization called British Helsinki Human Rights Group, which included several other people. One of the people that worked for that organization is Daniel McAdams, who's now the head of the Ron Paul Institute, and he was Ron Paul's staffer for foreign policy back when Ron Paul was still in Congress. Mm-hmm. These are guys that are literally on Russia's payroll.
Yeah, can you flesh that out on how Daniel McAdams would be on Russia's payroll there?
Well, again, his boss was this guy John Laughlin, who founded the British Helsinki Human Rights Group.
Right.
He started out in Hungary in the 90s, working with the Hungarian conservatives, which guess who, the party that he was affiliated with then is now Orban's party. And yep. Orban is one of the most pro-Russian heads of state in Europe.
He's mostly taken over all the democratic institutions of Hungary at this point. So yeah, we have to see where that goes. It's
not good. If you look at McAdams' videos from his home office, he's got a Belarusian flag up on the wall behind him.
Yeah.
And Belarus is the country that used to be part of the Soviet Union. And when the Soviet Union fell apart, they said, we're going to stay Soviet. They still have the KGB there. It's still called the KGB. They didn't even bother changing the name.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate what's happened to the people of Belarus. They tried their own revolution in 2020, and it just did not get there. But there were staged suicides. It was just awful.
Yeah. Talk about, the other sorts of things that Russia does when it doesn't get sufficient pushback. And if you cave into their nuclear blackmail, you're just going to get more of it. Some people said that the snipers that were shooting the protesters on Maidan were actually Russians in Ukrainian Berkut uniform. That's also the kind of thing that was done in Venezuela under Chavez. When there were protests against Chavez, there were Cuban snipers who were sent in there to shoot at the crowds. These are Russian-trained, Russian puppet regimes. That's how they operate. We're getting a lot of refugees now. Here's another thing, how it's affecting us. We're getting lots of refugees from Latin America flooding into the United States from places like Venezuela. And Cuba's helping them. Russia's helping them. They're beefing up their embassy staff in Mexico to help these people cross the border into the United States. If you're upset about illegal immigration coming to the United States, and I'm for free immigration in a lot of ways, but I think there's also valid reasons to be concerned about this. This is like the Mariel boat lift from Cuba in the early 80s, where Cuba basically said, okay, you want, Cuban dissidents? I'll give you Cuban dissidents. And he opened up all his prisons and all his mental hospitals, and he sent them all to Miami.
Yeah.
And there were riots in Miami for weeks because of that. He's doing the same thing he did the same thing with Syrian refugees and refugees from North Africa, sending them into Europe.
They're doing that at the border of the Baltics and Poland.
Yeah, exactly.
And that has been going on for 3 years now, since 2020, for like almost 4 years, since 2020, basically.
Exactly. Even just looking at the Ukrainian refugees, there are millions of them that had to flee their own country into neighboring countries, into Poland, Romania, and elsewhere. That's a huge economic burden. To take in all those refugees and accommodate them. You have to provide housing for them. You have to provide food for them. I'm sure most of them have gotten jobs because, they're hardworking, honest, productive people. But nevertheless, it's a massive demand spike to the economy and the supplies of those things.
Absolutely. It's absolutely a downstream effect of war, which this dictator has brought to the people of Ukraine and to the people of Europe in turn.
Yeah. So like in India, there was a war between Pakistan and India in 1973 because Pakistan invaded what was then known as East Pakistan, is now known as Bangladesh. And this caused a huge flood of refugees from East Pakistan into India across that border. India went to war with Pakistan because of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me try to bring this to a more American centric focus. I think you mentioned the border. I think that's very apropos. But, we have, also bringing it back to someone like Bob Kagan, we have a lot of characters now that are both on the left, of course, but even on the right, Bob Kagan being one, that are very concerned about what's going to happen with the MAGA, Steve Bannon type crowd that comes in with Trump. Now, I don't want to go through the whole, like, everything about Trump or everything like this, but I do think it's very, it's again, scary ties to me where you now have a reactionary, Bob Kagan just wrote a book, which I would recommend. It's called Rebellion. And in my opinion, he's a little bit, I think, I still do have a lot more faith and trust in America and America's institutions and America's liberalism, certainly a hell of a lot more than I have in anything that has to do with Russia, as we've established. They've never offered anything to the world like this. But, everybody's so jaded right now. It's just so black and white, one or the other, our side, your side. And you have a lot of these stressors like the border. So someone like Bob Kagan wrote this book where he drew a line from, all of the slave South to the Jim Crow laws and all sorts of other, events in between that, to the 60s and the civil rights movements there. And just every time it's, again, this sort of rebellion that, whether you call it the replacement theory or things like that, it's just, if people were against Jews, they were against Catholics, they were against Italians, they're against blacks. Usually he's referring to the Protestant white sort of minority is what he's talking about. But, I don't necessarily want to just make it about a race thing because people get upset about that. I don't really know how to ask the question, but it's sort of I think we're definitely at this time again where the actual liberal values of America are at risk, and it's at risk from all sides. It's not.
Yes.
I'm not saying it's. It almost sounds like I'm defending sort of the Democrat Party here now compared to the right. I'm not doing that, but I'm still pretty optimistic. I'm still bullish. I joke about this with a lot of my doom and gloomer friends, especially in the Bitcoin world, who are mostly doom and gloom and just disillusion with the American way of life. I'm very bullish on the general, idea of America and freedom. No matter what happens in November, I'm still bullish on that. But what are your thoughts about where we stand here from a idea of liberalism and defending that in America?
Sure. Yeah. I guess the best way I can answer that is to say that I don't know what Trump will do if he gets reelected. At this point in time, I think that's pretty likely that he will get reelected. I think Biden has finally shot himself in the foot so badly that it's hopeless.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, this was Biden's election to lose, and I think he's losing it. On the other hand, I was very concerned in 2016 about Trump's relationship with Russia and whether or not he was just a Russian stooge or going to be soft on Russia. I was very pleasantly surprised to the extent that he wasn't. Now, I didn't have very high expectations to begin with, but I've never been a huge Trump fan. I actually find him personally annoying. I can't stand to listen to him. My wife likes him. She's like, "Oh, let's watch the Trump rally." I'm like, no. I can summarize it for you in 3 sentences. But if you look at the actions that he took as president, he was harder on Russia than any president before him since the Cold War, since Reagan, really. Mm-hmm. And he was harder on him than Biden was until Biden reversed course after Russia invaded Ukraine. Trump sanctioned Nord Stream 2. Trump slapped tariffs on China, and China is Russia's biggest ally in the world. Trump destroyed Assad's air base after he launched a sarin gas attack on people in Syria. I wouldn't even say rebels because I don't think they were even combatants. He just decided, hey, I'm going to kill some people with sarin, and I still have some left, even though I said I gave it all away to Russia, and Russia destroyed it all, really. I actually looked for a list of, what all of Trump's Russia regarding presidential actions were, and I found one from the Brookings Institution, which is a center-left Democrat-type think tank, and they have a list of 50 executive actions by the Trump administration, and none of them were pro-Russia. He was in Germany telling Germany, you guys are addicted to Russian gas. You've got to stop that.
He's
and
right.
They laughed at him for it.
And
they thought
right.
It was hilarious. They thought it was ridiculous.
Yeah.
And I think if anyone has been discredited around the world more by Russia's invasion of Ukraine than anyone else, it's got to be Angela Merkel, whose whole theory of
100%.
relations with Russia was change through trade. I forget the German phrase, it's like Wandel mit Handel or something like that.
Yep. There's a great chart going around on Twitter, you can post it as well, where you look at France and their GDP per capita is just skyrocketing. Forget the little bumps during recessions or whatever. It's really, really high. We're talking like a 30-year chart. And then when they fully, or a 50-year chart, and then when they fully made their transition to nuclear, their CO2 emission footprint per capita is plummeting. And that's exactly what Germany gave up after Fukushima. I mean, it's just remarkable.
Exactly. I mean, there's some people have a bit of a debate about whether Merkel was a KGB agent or something, and I don't really know, but I ask the question, how would she have behaved differently if she was?
Yeah,
and that's hard to answer. I don't, and I've got friends in German national security circles who agree with me about this. The other thing here is that Trump was great for the U.S. domestic oil industry, which totally undercut Russia's oil revenues.
Yeah.
And I guarantee you he's going to try to do that again. There are a lot of things I can't predict about what Trump's going to do, but I guarantee you he's going to try and revive the U.S. oil industry. And that's not going to be good for Russia.
What do you think about the Bob Kagans or, the anti-Trump Republicans who, whatever general opinions they might have, the overall view seems to be that they're afraid of what will happen to the democratic institutions here. How vindictive he will be after all the trials and convictions and all the rest.
Yeah,
what do you think about that?
Well, part of it, I think there are some legitimate concerns there, but I think they're greatly exaggerated. So, for instance, whenever I hear the Democrats talking about threats to our democracy with capital letters, I interpret that as the party.
Mm-hmm.
They're talking about themselves.
Yeah.
And I think rightly so. I'm one of the people who, when Trump first got elected, I advocated that he really should have prosecuted Hillary Clinton over her insecure mail server. To me, that's just unforgivably unacceptable for anyone. I mean, if it had been somebody I really like Ted Cruz, I would have said, no, sorry, Ted, you got to go. Off to jail. That's just unacceptable. I mean, she had these ridiculous, lame excuses like, oh, I didn't know that the C at the top of the documents on my air-gapped, secure skiff system meant classified. Like, oh, really? You didn't know that C was for classified? Do we need to make a Sesame Street video for you?
Yeah.
I think, honestly, Trump was too soft on a lot of people in his first term.
Are you worried that he could be too hard this time, go a little bit too fascist?
That's always a possibility. It's a risk. I think a lot of it is going to depend on who he picks for his vice presidential candidate, his running mate. I don't like a lot of people they're talking about as possibilities there. I don't like J.D. Vance. I don't like Ramaswamy for a lot of reasons, even though he says good things a lot of the time, but I don't think he's trustworthy, and he says bad things the other half of the time. I don't like the fact that Trump feels like he has to pander to the anti-Ukraine Republicans in his base. I'm more inclined to go along with. There's a guy on Twitter named Randy Mott, M-O-T-T.
Yep.
He's a Republican, lives in Poland. He argues that the Republican establishment is basically going to win Trump over, and Trump's going to basically claim victory by saying, oh, we're no longer going to give away all this stuff to Ukraine for free. It's going to be loans. And I'm actually fine with that. I think that it should have been Lend-Lease already for a long time. That would have been a lot better.
Yeah.
I think also
He's a
Trump
good follow on Twitter, yeah.
Yeah, and like ultimately, I feel like in 2016, I held my nose harder than I ever had before in my lifetime when I voted. I voted for Trump. The only reason I did at that time is I thought, at least we're not going to have another Benghazi under Trump. And I can't say that about Hillary because we already did have one.
Yeah.
And there wasn't. That was pretty impressive to me. I don't think Trump would be the sort of president that would let himself let a country, an ally like Ukraine, fall to Russia. I think that would be a huge political loss for him, and I don't think he'd be willing to accept that. I just don't see it happening. I think, when Zelensky got elected in Ukraine, he ran as the negotiation guy. Like, I'm not going to be so hard on Putin. I think we can make a deal. He quickly learned the error of his ways when he actually had to try it. Trump is saying a lot of things like that now. Oh, I can negotiate with Putin, blah, blah, blah. I don't think he's going to find it anywhere near as easy as he says. He's going to have to change his mind. He's going to have to reverse course. And I think he's most likely at that point. Trump was also the first one to start selling weapons to Ukraine. Obama wouldn't do it. Biden was not for it. Trump said, yeah, we want javelins. Okay, here you go. You have some javelins. So I think the most likely reversal, of course, there for Trump is to say, okay, but we're going to end this thing as quickly as we possibly can. Whatever Ukraine needs to hit Russia so hard, they will never, ever think about doing this ever again. Ukraine's going to get. I hope so. I could be wrong.
Yeah.
On the other hand, Trump claims that he already threatened to nuke Moscow if Putin invaded Ukraine before. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. I don't know, but he said that he did.
Back to nuclear blackmail.
Yeah, it can go two ways. How come we have to be the only ones deterred by nuclear threats and they don't?
Yeah. I just want to say regarding the Ukraine part, thinking about the Ukrainians, knowing what I know about the history of this part of the world, and just anybody who's subjugated, if they're not going to give up. So it doesn't matter if Trump says sue for peace. You're going to have this guerrilla warfare that you mentioned earlier in this episode. You're going to have that, and Ukrainians are just not going to stop fighting. So listen, Tim, it's really interesting. I'd love to go on for hours more, but I think we got to close it soon. But I have one more question regarding Israel. We haven't talked about them yet, not going through the whole conflict, but obviously it seems that Putin, from the beginning, Hamas has met with Putin multiple times, I believe, and they've been, to Moscow. They've already pledged their support for them for a long time. So I think it's quite clear from that side where Russia stands. But do you have anything to say about that conflict and where Russia fits in?
Sure. Well, going back a little bit, not too much here in history, because we can go way back if we want to.
Yeah.
In short, the Iranian Revolution was Soviet-sponsored. The Ayatollah neutralized that for a while because there was a defector from Western intelligence, it was either MI6 or somebody else, that gave the Ayatollah Khomeini a list of all of the Soviet agents within his regime, and the Ayatollah had them liquidated. But certainly after that, pretty soon after that, I think by the 90s, Iran was back into the Russian orbit, and Russia and Iran have been allied ever since. One of the bizarre things about the current diplomacy that's been going on about Iran's nuclear program is, guess who's representing Iran in those negotiations? It's Russia. The the Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps heavily coordinates with Russian intelligence. Iran controls Hamas. They give them like 90% of their funding. Iran also controls Hezbollah. Iran controls the Houthis. The head of Fatah, which is supposed to be the relatively good Palestinians in the West Bank, he was a KGB agent. He wrote his PhD thesis at a Soviet university advocating Holocaust denial. Once again, coming back to that. This is supposed to be the good guy, Mahmoud Abbas. If that's what passes for good over there, you don't want to see the bad.
It's unbelievable.
I think Hamas are, some of the most horrible people ever. And I don't say that lightly. They make the Nazis look like softies. And the Nazis were, one of my standard positions about a lot of these things is that if you want to be anti-interventionist, fine. But don't downplay the evil of the guys you're saying that we shouldn't be fighting.
It's just incredible. I mean, don't be non-truthful. It's the same thing that these libertarians are doing about Putin. They're just not telling the truth about all the atrocities that he's committed and the genuine liberty that Ukrainians are going for. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean, if there's a good case to be made for anti-intervention, and then it should be strong enough to withstand saying we should not intervene to stop someone who's truly horrible. Yep. But going back to Israel here, I am very much fully in support of Israel wiping out Hamas. It's one of the things I was happy to see Walter Block coming out on the right side of, and I've been in touch with him about it. Despite the fact that he was friends with Rothbard for so many decades, somehow they disagreed about Israel and their friendship survived. But Block has now been purged by Hoppe, because Hoppe is nowhere near as congenial as Rothbard, apparently. I certainly think that that's all connected and being run out of the Kremlin. The Soviets, right after World War II, Stalin and Mao, after the Chinese Revolution, Stalin and Mao basically made a deal where Stalin put Russia in charge of spreading the revolution in Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and the Western Hemisphere. And he told Mao that he was in charge of spreading it in Asia. And that division has remained roughly in place ever since. The other aspect here to point out is that Russian military intelligence never even got a name change after the Soviet collapse. Its initials are the GRU. And we know almost nothing about what it does. I've tried to look for history books about it, and there's nothing after World War II. They just don't say anything. There's a few things. We had a few defectors that wrote about it. I haven't read those books yet, but the GRU is very heavily involved in all of these countries. And Wagner Group is involved in a whole lot more of them too, still, even after the death of Prigozhin. Wagner Group has essentially taken over a huge swath of Central Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, within the past decade. They're in the Central African Republic. They're in Sudan. They're supporting coups. They're, mass murdering people. They're basically doing it to extract as much gold and whatever else they can out of those countries and send it back home to Russia to fund Russia's
rare earths and minerals.
Yep, exactly. And in the countries where Russia's not doing that, China's saying, hey, we want cobalt. We want everything we can use to make batteries for electric cars and cell phones and all that so that we can sell them to the West. So there's a huge aspect here. I think Russia had to have given the green light to Hamas. My speculative theory about the reason for that is I think Putin got sick and tired of the Democrats supporting Ukraine. And so he realized that he could split the Democrat Party over Israel. And that's what's happening. We've got the far left supporting the Palestinians and the more moderate Democrats still supporting Israel as they have for a long time. But it's causing a huge, huge political problem for them. Biden keeps appeasing or trying to appease the pro-Palestinians in some way by saying, we'll give them humanitarian aid, or, we'll tell Israel not to do things as much, you know. But it's a major political liability for him.
Do you see any more complication though with that situation? I'm just trying to be balanced here. I mean, obviously, I lean pretty much the same as you, pro-Israel, very much. One side has always been shooting rockets at the other side. One side's been defending against those rockets. But that the history of that conflict is very complicated. Talk about borders, talk about settlements, talk about who's in what area. That's a quagmire, in my opinion, that's way more complicated than the white and black conflict of Ukraine. What do you think about that?
I think I'm very much on the pro-Israel side of things. I've read a lot about that also. I think ultimately what it comes down to is that Israel tried as hard as it possibly could to reclaim their land peacefully. I don't buy into the notion that they stole a whole bunch of Palestinian land in 1948. I don't think that's true. It's just not. They bought land. But ultimately what it came down to is the Arabs refused to allow Jews to have their own state anywhere. They're like the ultimate NIMBYs. In Islamic theology, every other religion is supposed to be inferior to them. It is a supremacist religion. Again, it has no separation of religion and state.
Yeah.
I think that's a much bigger deal than we think most these days. They basically believe that the only right that other religions have is to be ruled by them. And they also inherited the theory from the Romans that any land that has ever been conquered by Islam rightfully belongs to Islam ever after. And so that obviously includes all of what used to be, Palestine, the Ottoman Empire, Spain. They've said things. Al-Qaeda used to talk about, the loss of Andalus, which was Spain, or Spain was Andalus. Yeah. They want it all back, and they refuse to give up. So I think it really ultimately comes down to a question of, money, manpower, ammunition, supplies, weapons. As long as Hamas and these Hezbollah and these others keep getting support from the outside, and they're dependent on that support. One of the rules about these conflicts that I learned a long time ago, whether you call them guerrillas, Hamas are not really guerrillas because they were the ruling regime in Gaza, is they're almost always completely dependent on outside support in order to survive and win. If they don't have that, they almost always lose. So they need to be cut off. Again, Trump had maximum sanctions on Iran. Biden lifted them. Biden's given Iran so much sanctions relief. It's astounding. Iran's made billions and billions, tens of billions of dollars off of sanctions relief since Biden took office. And Biden's got Iranian spies that have been identified and called out working high up in his regime. So why is this happening? Why are they there? Why do they have their jobs? I don't understand. They should be gone. There's no point to this. Again, I think that's something where Trump will probably be better. Trump is definitely much more pro-Israel than he is pro-Ukraine, even though I think hopefully he will be more pro-Ukraine than he's talking right now.
Yeah,
I could be wrong, but I can hope. His daughter converted to Judaism. His son-in-law is Orthodox. He allowed the Israeli government finally to move its capital to Jerusalem. Yeah. Move the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So I'm pretty hopeful about that one, but I think basically Hamas has got to be wiped out as an example for all the others, and then there needs to be some serious cracking down on Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iran. And Biden also, he's the one that basically said, let's stop the other Arab states from fighting the Houthis. Let's let the Houthis take over Yemen. Why anyone thought this was a good idea, I have no idea.
I can't argue with your consistency there. And I think that generally what we're talking here is about liberalism versus, as Bob Kagan called it, anti-liberalism. and I think there is a lot of that.
And Israel is not by no means the freest economy in the world, but they're pretty high up there, especially thanks to Netanyahu. Netanyahu privatized a whole bunch, deregulated a whole bunch. Israel has total free trade with the United States. Netanyahu made it a point to wean Israel off of all U.S. aid except for military aid. And the military aid to Israel is loans, and Israel pays them back. It's loan guarantees, basically. The only thing Israel is allowed to do with the money is buy U.S. equipment and supplies, which Israel does. It's the only way they can get them. And they pay back the loans. So the net cost to the U.S. taxpayer is nothing.
Tim, it's very interesting. Listen, we've gone 3 hours. I think we could go 3 more. But today I'm going to have to cut it here. So listen, we should do this again. It's very interesting. I think, these topics, I think, are, when we talk about liberalism, these are the fights of our times that are coming, and it's going to be here, for the next 30 years. Who knows? But we haven't even talked about it.
Well, I would love to do it again. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me on.
Yeah, we haven't even talked about how high interest rates affect all this stuff as well. So it's a whole other thing. But listen. As we close it, where should our listeners and viewers go to find you? And I say that I will link all the stuff in the show notes as well.
Okay, well, I am on Twitter. I don't post a whole lot of my own original material. I'm a bit of a reply guy, I admit. I do repost stuff that I find that's interesting. I'm also on Facebook. I'm not as active there because Facebook keeps trying to be annoying in various ways, telling me they either don't like something that I share that I found in another Facebook group they allow in that other Facebook group, or they tell me I'm doing something too fast and I have no idea what it is. But I am on Facebook. And as you're going to link, I've been contributing to liberpedia.org, which is run by a friend of mine. He's a Swiss-Czech guy, lives in Switzerland, who I'm good friends with. I like him a lot. So he runs that site, and he was happy to post some of my stuff. So, if people like what I have to say, then please do find me and get in touch.
Wonderful articles, down to earth, consistent, and liberal. That's what I like about them. So I really appreciate your thoughts there, and it's important to me as well. So, listen, Tim, thanks a lot for joining. We'll close it there, and until next time, take care.